The elders of the clan spoke of many things during the gatherings. They knew a lot, for they had lived long lives. Some of them longer than any other on all of the land, it was said. Some of them even remembered a time when the skies hadn't been black. They spoke of it rarely, only in whispers, as if they were afraid that to talk of the Great Fire or his Silver Queen and her shining daughters would draw the ire of the stalkers. Perhaps they were right to do so. Perhaps this was mere superstition. Malone did not know. The young boy knew, however, that he liked the stories of Before the Dark. They were sad, of course, because they always made him think of what his people had lost, but to know that the dark hadn't always been here was comforting, warming. Malone didn't know any word to design what he felt when he could persuade an elder to tell him what the land had been before the dark. It was akin to what he had felt when he had been but an infant, clutching to his mother near the fire, knowing that he was safe here, that the stalkers wouldn't attack the camp. It had been a false knowledge, of course, as he had learned when the stalkers had taken his mother so long ago. The elders said that it had been years, but what was a year? The people of the land couldn't understand what they meant by it. They measured time, when they bothered with it at all, in the periods of rest and activity. They hunted and scavenged amidst the stones until they were too tired to keep evading the stalkers, at which point they returned to the camp. When they met humans of other clans, sometimes they fought, sometimes they traded, sometimes they ignored each other. When they found a stalker's nest, they destroyed it, killing the young before they could grow. It was a dangerous deed, as it drew the anger of the parent, but it was the only way to prevent the stalkers from growing too numerous. That was the way of life in the land, the only way Malone had ever known, the only way there had been since the coming of the dark. That story wasn't one he liked. According to the elders, it had been a time even worse than those that had followed. Creatures called demons, even more cruel and twisted than the stalkers had walked the land, specters out of hell who drew power from the dark itself to manifest. They had hunted the people for a long time, until finally, they had vanished. But they had left behind the dark, and the stalkers which were said to be their spawn, the product of their mating with humans. But if the demons were the makers of the stalkers, why did the elders insist that the children who were born different from the others had to been killed, lest they join the ranks of the dark's hunters? It did not make sense to Malone. But then again, he was just a boy. There was a lot of things he didn't understand. Another story told of a giant who had fallen from the sky on wings of fire, an angel that had been banished from heaven and who had brought the dark and the demons upon the land in vengeance before descending in person to inflict further torments. But the elders told that story even less often than those about the time before the dark, for none of them could claim to have ever seen the fallen one. The stories about him originated from the nightmares and the visions that had stricken the people of the land during the coming of the dark, and, more rarely, in the times that had followed. Sometimes these visions even revealed secrets to the elders, where to find the nest of a stalker that had been particularly aggressive, or the direction to new scavenging grounds. Sometimes, they were lies and traps, and led the deceived clan into ruin and extinction. But never could the elders who received these visions know whether or not they were true, for the designs of the fallen one were impossible to understand to mortals. So, more often than not, the clan's chiefs took the risk of following the message, as while it sometimes brought trials, denying them was said to draw the wrath of the destitute angel. "Hey, Malone," said Igdal. "Wake up. We've got to go." The boy stirred from his reveries, and faced his friend. Igdal was tall for his age, 2 heads taller than Malone. He was strong, too, and some whispered on his back that he wasn't smart. Malone knew better. Igdal just seemed to be slow because he always took the time to consider everything he did. Dirty white hair hung to his shoulders, the mark of those born after the dark had come. Malone wore that mark as well, though he kept his own hair short, at the cost of many cuts on his skull skin when he used whatever blade he had at hand to cut his mane. Like Malone, Igdal was an orphan. Unlike him, he hadn't lost both of them to the stalkers. His father had been a hunter and had vanished one cycle, never to return to the camp, while his mother had died during a battle with another clan for control of a pond of water. It had been during that battle that both of the youngsters had killed another of the land's people for the first time, fighting side by side. "Have the hunters returned?" he asked, his own voice just as soft as Igdal's. Everyone in the land spoke softly, in an effort not to be heard by the stalkers. In fact, he couldn't remember hearing anyone raise his or her voice apart for the screams when the stalkers caught someone. "No," answered Igdal. But the chief says that we need to move regardless. If they are still alive, they will catch up to us. How will they know where we are? It was a valid question. When a clan moved the position of its camp, it did so with great care, erasing all traces of its former presence. The remnants of a camp could be studied. After all, the strength of the clan that had inhabited it determined from what it had left behind. And if a clan was weak, then others could decide to attack it. Malone didn't think it cruel or evil, it was simply the way of life in the land. Traces of the moving clan were also erased, so as to diminish the chances that they may be attacked while on the move. Some clans had tried to leave signs for those they had been forced to leave behind, but they had been exterminated. Apparently, regardless of the subtlety of the signs, the stalkers were able to find and follow them to the exposed prey that had laid them out. Igdal simply shrugged, and Malone understood. The chief couldn't afford to wait any longer. They had stayed here too long already. He had slept 6 times since they had set camp here, and the stalkers were doubtlessly already starting to converge on them, drawn to their presence by the smell of fresh prey. Even if the hunters hadn't returned, they just couldn't risk staying at the same place any longer. As he rose and gathered his few belongings, Malone briefly wondered what life would be like if they didn't have to move regularly. They could build better shelters, gather bigger stocks, perhaps even start cultivating the mushrooms that made a good portion of their diet. Useless thoughts. He needed to focus on the present, moving. Then, if the hunters didn't come back, he and Igdal would have to help gather food. Until now, their tasks in the clan had consisted in helping with the cycle-to-cycle life in the camp, but they had learned some of the tricks of the hunters. Not all of them, of course, but if no one else remained, they would have to go out of the camp's relative security and find supplies for the rest of the clan. "Let's go then," he finally said, having finished packing his possessions in a small tissue bag that his mother had made for him before her death. All around him, the rest of the clan was doing the same, and though a few were obviously reluctant to leave this place, those whose relatives were among the hunters, none challenged the chief's decision. It was the only course of action possible and they all knew it, bitter as it may be. Soon all was ready. The traces of the camp were erased, and 62 men and women of various ages started to walk amidst the ruins of what had once been the hive world called Mula Secundus. Of all the great towers, spires and buildings that had once graced the hives of the planet, only one remained standing. It had been the center of this world, the host of the minds that controlled every aspect of life across continents made one by the draining of the oceans. From its myriad of rooms, acolytes and servants of the Adeptus Administratum had brought order to the logistical nightmare that had been Mula Secundus' daily life. Now, the governor's palace stood still, but empty and derelict. When the warp storm had claimed this world and the horrific denizens of the Empyrean had been unleashed upon its people, less than a few 100,000 out of billions had survived. The governor himself had died quickly, but he had discovered that death wasn't the end the imperial truth had claimed it to be. Even now, the warrior that looked down upon Mula Secundus from the man's former office thought he could hear his screams as his soul endured yet another torture at the demon's hands. Time had flowed strangely on the planet since the storm had cut it off from the rest of the universe. By his power armor's chronometer's account, the warrior had been down on the planet for less than a month. But by the count of his twin heartbeats that he had kept since his arrival, it had been almost 6 decades. He had been warned that this would happen. In fact, his entire mission relied upon it. He had known that he would be alone on this damned world, alone to perform his commander's orders. Failure from his part would doom the whole thing, for there would be no backup, no help coming from his brothers outside of this planet's cosmic isolation cell. But still, solitude on such a scale, it had marked him. And the warp storm, what the survivors called, with a simplicity that was almost perfectly apt, the dark, hadn't helped matters. He was a wholly different being that he had been when he had descended upon the planet in a drop pod covered in arcane symbols so as to breach through the barrier of blackness that surrounded Mula Secundus. His armor and his flesh had changed, altered by the same powers that had given life to the race of mutants that now hunted the remnants of the planet's population. Under the ceramite plates, his skin was covered in thin scales like those of a reptile, and his helmet hid the vertical pupils of his eyes, the vanishing of his nose, melted back into his face, and his forked tongue. His armor was alive, that was the only word for it. It fed off his bloodstream, draining heat from him to sustain its mechanisms. He had to spend long periods near fires that were increasingly difficult to aliment so that he wouldn't fall prey to hypothermia. Its machine spirit had become some alliance of mechanic and demonic, and it hungered for its wearer's life. Every moment was a battle to keep his own equipment from claiming his soul. Yet this transformation also had its advantages. In return for heat, the armor kept his metabolism active, feeding him his own recycled waste over and over without any loss of nutritional value, an impossibility made real by whatever energies now animated his armor. The sound of an alarm drew the warrior out of his meditation, and he turned back to the last functioning piece of technological wonder on this world. An entire wall of the giant office was covered in screens, reporting data sent by 1,000 servo skulls scattered across the planet. Another wall was covered in writing from the warrior's own hand, notes on all the thousands of bloodlines he was monitoring. For 3 generations, he had stood vigil, watching over the remnants of this world's people, the strongest, harshest and most determined of the billions that had once lived meaningless lives in slavery to the Imperium. For decades, he had acted in the shadows, visiting some of the clan's elders under the cover of enough drugs to make them believe his visits were mere dreams, and influenced their decision. He had brought some clans closer to new hunting ground, and others into yet harsher lands, where they would almost inevitably go extinct. The servo skulls had also been put to use for more than just spying. They had sprayed pheromones to drive away some of the stalkers, or bring them closer, and ensure that some of the humans with the most interesting traits would mate and give birth to a next generation even more suited to the designs of the warrior's lord. As the near-omniscient watcher of Mula Secundus, he had made reality the great plan of his master, emulating natural selection with his own will in command, to make this world's people into what the Lord of the Forsaken Sons required for his warband. To this end, he had become both a guardian and a plague on the humans, though they didn't know of him. "We need replacements for the brothers we have lost, my friend. Some will be found on Mula Prime, but the conditions on Mula Secundus make it uniquely suited for us to harvest specimens gifted with great potential." Such had been the words of Arkan the Awakened One when he had explained his plan to battle brother Jacaerys, formerly an apothecary of the Alpha Legion, now as loyal and dedicated to the Forsaken Sons as any other aboard the Hand of Ruin. Alpha Rias and Omegan's plan to bring Horus upon the throne of terror had failed, and now, with his legions scattered to the corners of the galaxy, each group of the 20th Legion had to choose its own course, as was the way of Alpha Rias' sons. Those that had been rescued from terror, where they had been at the behest of their Primarch, a separate force from the rest of the Legion, scattered across the galaxy to hinder the Loyalists' efforts, had made their choice. They would follow Arkan until death came to them all. The rank of the son of Horus had nothing to do with his command of the warband. Ranks inter-legion had always been a tricky matter, and the fact that Arkan's own title of commander was a customized rank due to his command of the prototype ship that was the Hand of Ruin didn't help that. Even Alexandra, the World Eater who had died during the first strike on Mula Prime, before Jacaerys had been sent to the second planet of the system, had held a technically higher rank than the Awakened Ones. No, it had been Arkan's prowess in battle and words about their Primarch, though the Awakened One didn't know, and would never know, of his dual nature, that had convinced Jacaerys' brothers that he was a leader worth following, one who would bring glory to his warband and inflict much damage upon the Imperium. And despite the confusion that had occurred during the rebellion, Jacaerys was convinced that one thing remained true: the Imperium must fall. It was the one constant in a universe that had stopped to make sense in a web of lies and deceptions on a galactic scale, and the warrior clung to it like a drowning man to a floating log. Unseemly, perhaps, but it was the only thing that had kept him from going too much insane during his decades of near-absolute isolation. For he was insane, of that there was little doubt. He could hear meaningless whispers in the shadows, as if surrounded by conspirators, and some of the plans he had made, upon later examinations, were so obviously flawed that he wondered how he had come to make them in the first place. And then there were the voices of the damned, though he wasn't certain if that last part was him or the place where he had made his lair. When he looked up at what had caused the alarm, he saw that one of the clans had started to move without waiting for its hunters to come back. That had been a good decision. The hunters were already dead. They had been attacked by a pack of stalkers, and failed to defeat the mutants. But despite this decision, the clan was still doomed. The road they had taken would bring them near another group of humans, one which had proved in the past its members' eagerness to kill other survivors with little to no provocation. With most of their warriors lost, the walking clan would be either slaughtered or enslaved. And that was something Jacaerus simply couldn't allow. He had invested too much time in the running clan. Their loss of warriors had been a freak occurrence, something he had known could happen and had made contingencies for, but not something he had actually believed would happen. The bloodlines he had carefully cultivated to be free of mutation, a task whose growing irony hadn't escaped him, while becoming more potent with each generation, were now in peril. In seconds, his mind reviewed all the possibilities that were still open to him, the backup plans he had set up for such situations. One of the tenets of the Alpha Legion's teachings was that there wasn't such a thing as an event that couldn't be turned to one's advantage, regardless of how dear it may seem. There was a way to make this apparent setback into, yes, here it was, a plan designed just for such a situation, and that he had reviewed enough time to be almost sure that it wasn't the fruits of one of his crises of madness. Sometimes, being forced to double-check all of his work could be tedious. Jacaerus commanded his armor's machine spirit, and the demonic hybrid complied, projecting schematics and graphs on his visual lenses. The Marine checked the numbers, the position of the different clans, and saw that all was as he had anticipated. He felt something that he hadn't felt in a long time, exultation. Finally, it seemed, he would be able to reach the objective of his self-imposed exile on this miserable ruined planet. If he could pull off this last gambit, there would be enough potential reinforcements on Mula Secundus for him to send the signal to the Hand of Ruin. At least, he could be reunited with his brothers. The Space Marine went to the lowest level of the Governor's Palace, and entered a room that had once been occupied by hundreds of vehicles, waiting here for adepts needing to be brought to any point of the Hive City and beyond. Now, the vehicles, cars and aerial transport alike, were nothing but wreckage, torn apart by the demons or looted by Mula Secundus survivors. Only one still stood, Jacaerus' own customized war bike. He had stolen it from a White Scars legionary during the Siege of Terror, and made it as silent as it was possible. A Space Marine could hear it coming, but to mortals, it was all but impossible to detect. During his exile, it had allowed him to reach any corner of Mula Secundus quickly. Now, it was time for it to be put to the test once more. The destination Jacaerus had in mind was far from the palace, and time was of the essence. He sat on the engine and executed the appropriate rites to ensure the bike was in a state to perform what he was about to ask of it. Then, once he was sure that his steed wouldn't fail him, Jacaerus of the Forsaken Sons, former apothecary of the 24th Great Company of the Alpha Legion, now alone, mutant and heretic, activated his bike, and started his course to the location of what he hoped would be his last action on the world his lord's actions had doomed to an endless night where even the stars had gone dark. Malone and Igdal walked at the back of the small caravan, carrying packs that the elders were unable to bear themselves. Some had claimed that the old men and women were burden that should be abandoned, but these were fools. The knowledge and wisdom of the elders was priceless in keeping the clan alive. So, despite the weight of the combined packs, the youngsters gritted their teeth and forced themselves to keep pace with the rest of the clan. All around them, as far as they could see in the little pocket of light emitted by their torches, was the wreckage of what the elders said had once been a great city. Though the concept of city was alien to Malone, he recognized that those who had created things that had become so much rubble when they had been destroyed had to be mighty indeed. Rocks were everywhere, with only the most narrow of paths left available through them. The people's ears were strained to perceive the echoes of their own steps and breath, their minds thriving to render an image of their surroundings. That skill had appeared soon after the coming of the dark, when the people of the land hadn't yet found the means to craft torches from the fungus that grew on the ruins and had been forced to rely on increasingly scarce sources of light from the past. Malone had once seen such a relic function. It was an old thing, kept preciously by one of the elders. It had wondered him that his ancestors had been able to trap light in little boxes such as this one for later use. Without any reliable source of light, the hearing of the land's people had grown stronger with time, and now they were able to map their surroundings almost 100 meters around them, while the hunters, who were forced to forsake the use of their eyes entirely, could run and fight with nothing more than their ears, nose and hands to guide them. The humans weren't the only ones to have picked up that ability. Malone had seen several stalkers' corpses before the monsters were burned, the scent of their burnt flesh nearly unbearable but a very effective repellent to their kindred. The creatures were all of different forms and shapes, but they had shared one common trait, eyes that were either blind or absent entirely. The young man's memories rose to the surface, creatures covered in feathers or scales, with fangs the size of a grown man's arm or claws dripping with venom. "Stop dreaming," said Igdal. He hadn't even turned to face his companion, but knew him enough. Malone shook himself out of his reveries, and focused on the march. One step after another, while keeping his senses alert. Without the hunters to keep watch over the clan, the responsibility of being on guard at every moment fell to all. "Thank you," he whispered to his friend. "It's nothing," answered the giant. He had long grown used to Malone's habit of losing himself in his thoughts, regardless of the situation. The clan kept walking for a long time, almost an entire cycle. They climbed several mounts of rubble, careful in their footing. Despite the hurry they were in, no member of the clan harmed himself during the perilous journey. Finally, they arrived at what the chief judged to be an appropriate place for setting up their camp. They began to drop their bags and install what little kindling they had carried with them to start the great fire at the center of the camp. Malone and Igdal were helping the others when the first hint that something wasn't right arrived. The clan's chief, a man who according to the elders' strange way of measuring time had survived for 30 years and bore the name of Avidane, who had been helping deploy the circle of metal stakes that was to surround the camp, one of the most effective defenses against stalkers' attacks, as the charging beasts couldn't perceive the weapons before they tore into their flesh, whistled a signal that was known to all of his brethren. Instantly, all movements ceased, and near absolute silence fell upon the camp. Each man and woman focused, some of them closing their eyes to heighten their hearing further. The signal meant that the chief thought he had heard something but did not know what, and needed silence to identify the disturbance. Perhaps the hunters had returned, thought Malone with a surge of hope in his heart. Or perhaps, more sensibly, it had merely been a false alarm, the sound detected by the chief a mere rock falling after months of oscillating in precarious position. Then Malone heard the battle cry of another clan and the sound of men charging as the need for discretion was cast to the wind, and he knew that he and his people were doomed. Tens of men and women emerged from their hiding places all around the camp, carrying the crude weapons that the people of the land were able to create, iron bars, blades salvaged from the ruins, and the very rare and unique firearm, with its precious ammunition, granting its wield a great advantage against any foe, no matter his skill. They were outnumbered, unprepared, and surrounded. They were all going to die or be captured and enslaved, thought Malone with a strange, cold detachment. His clan, his family, was going to be destroyed, not by the stalkers or the dangers of the land, but by his fellow humans. There was something about that fact that struck him as being fundamentally wrong. This wasn't how it should be. He had shared these thoughts with Igdal before, when his friend's mother had been killed at the hands of another clan. The giant had agreed. Something was wrong with the land, that it made humans kill other humans. Or perhaps, he had added with a grim expression, something was wrong with them. Had they not killed, too? Yes, they had. And now, they would do so again. A scream rose from the depths of Malone's being, filled with rage at the fate of his brethren. He drew his weapon, a steel axe he had taken as trophy from the corpse of the man he had killed, and charged the closest assailant. Igdal was but a step behind him, his own tool of death, a club of iron the size of Malone's tight, clutched firmly in both hands. He came face to face with his foe, a man wearing the same dirty, half-ruined clothing as he, and gripping a spear made of an iron bar with a knife knotted to the extremity. Recognizing the range of the weapon as the primary threat of the duel, Malone advanced toward the stranger. He blocked the spear's assault with his own weapon before punching the man in the face and kicking him between his legs, too fast for him to react. As the enemy fell on the ground, Malone brought his axe into an arc that cut the throat of the man and spilled his blood on the stone. The young man saw the liquid flow with a dark satisfaction, and the words of Igdal seemed truer, and more wrong, than ever. They were killers, and that was a cruel thing, but it was the right state of things in a world that had no mercy for the weak. To kill or to be killed, it was the only way of the land. With the taste of blood on his lips and Igdal at his back, he plunged once more into the fray, determined to make the enemy pay a heavy tribute for its attack. More and more foes came to confront him, and Malone's axe tore through flesh, finding the weaknesses and vulnerabilities in his opponent's guard with preternatural ease. Time seemed to have slowed down around him, leaving his enemies moving as if underwater. No enemy could reach him, and his axe reaped a harvest of lives that made his heart sing with pride. At his back, covering Malone as instinctively as Malone was covering him, Igdal fought with a fury barely contained but contained nonetheless. Each of his strike was given with the precise amount of force required, shattering bones and creaking skulls open. Each attack of his enemies was met with a parry, diverted to the side, or taken head-on in return for an opportunity to finish his current adversary. The young man was covered in wounds, his own blood soaking his shirt, but his tremendous endurance allowed him to ignore the combined effect of the superficial cuts. On and on the two friends fought, their mind occluded by the red veil of battle, locked in a seemingly endless dance of war made of attacks, parries and ripostes. More and more corpses fell to the ground as they moved through the battlefield their camp had become, rallying the rest of their brethren behind them. Overcome by the sensations of battle, Malone howled at the back sky, the sound sending the assailants reeling back, fear clearly visible on their pale faces. He felt something, a shadow at the back of his awareness, that was watching him, judging him. Somehow, he felt as if he had to prove himself to whatever that presence was. Lowering his head, he charged once more into the fray. Chikaris was smiling under his helm. After hiding his bike some distance from the sight and running the rest of the way with all the stealth a son of Alpharius was capable of, he had arrived just in time for the battle's beginning, and it looked as if the bet he had taken was going to pay off. The pheromones he had diffused on the battling humans had been specially calibrated to the two youngsters, the products of carefully engineered bloodlines, in order to awaken their latent potential. The smaller one possessed both a rage that evoked that of the World Eaters and a gift for anticipating his opponent's moves that had taken much discreet chemical injections to bring. The taller one was possessed of a stamina far above that of a common man, with a mind more grounded to balance his counterpart's regrettable tendencies to daydreaming, a byproduct of his enhanced subconscious. And these two were only a sample of what he had made of the people of this world, using the terribly selective environment and the tools he had brought from the ship. The other Fleshmasters would be amazed of what he had wrought here, with very limited resources. At least, they would if these two survived the test of battle. Only then would Chikaris be satisfied with his results. If they died, he would start anew, even if it took him another half-century. He would accept nothing less than the best from those who were to receive the gene seed stored aboard the Hand of Ruin's Apothecarian. But despite his own near-infinite patience, he wanted this to come to an end. The numbers of the people of this planet were ever diminishing, and once it reached a certain point, inbreeding and mutations brought by the influence of the warp cover would cause irredeemable damage to the genetics he had so carefully cultivated. His own stocks of chemicals was also dangerously low. No, he would have to call the awakened one soon, regardless of the results he had achieved, or die in vain, his mission a complete failure. But it wouldn't come to that, he was sure. The young humans were magnificent to look at. They lacked the might of the Astartes, of course, but they were examples of what mere mortals could achieve, with a little help from science, and Chikaris was once more remembered that Archon wanted to add mortal armies to the assets of the Forsaken Sons. When he returned to the ship, he decided he would ask his lord to allow him to perform the same operations on these mortals that he had on the population of Mula Secundus. He saw the thinner boy howl, and for a second he thought he saw the human look straight at him. It was impossible that he had noticed the hiding Astartes, or was it? And if he had, did that mean that he surpassed even Chikaris' predictions, or simply that the Space Marine's skills were getting sloopy? No way to know for certain, he decided. He would have to wait and see. There weren't many of the assailants left standing by now. No matter, they had been a failure anyway, upon which he had given up years ago. The only reason he hadn't engineered their destruction sooner instead of letting them consume valuable resources was that they could still be useful, in the exact fashion they had been right now. They had helped to bring about the true potential of those he had created, and for that they should feel honored. Their deaths had a lot more meaning than their lives could ever have hoped to have. The man who had led the boys' tribe, a specimen worthy of interest, too, but too old for integration in the Forsaken Sons and thus expendable, died, his head bursting under the fire of a bolt pistol that the assailants' own leader had somehow managed to scavenge in the ruins. This was worrying. The man had kept the weapon hidden until now, no doubt wanting to spare the ammunition as much as he could. If he was desperate enough to use it, then his next targets would undoubtedly be the boys. And as much as Chikaris wanted them to be tested, surviving bolt of fire without any armor wasn't something he expected from them. Not yet, anyway. The Astartes drew his own bolt pistol, a model far heavier and more elaborate than what the human clumsily wielded, and took aim. Before the chief could shoot at his specimen, he focused on the shot, eliminating everything else than the target, his gun, and himself, and pushed the trigger. And with this, he thought, my Xi lens. One way or another. Malone watched as the head of the man who had just killed Avadain exploded in a fountain of gore. The sound of the shot, the same sound that when the headless corpse had slain the chief, rang in his ears, but a dozen times louder. All fighters, who had been trying to kill each other but seconds ago, froze where they stood. Several fell on their knees, clutching their heads, trying to ease the pain in their ears. Malone's own auditory map of his surroundings was lost to the ringing that followed the shot. Then, he heard another sound. Footsteps, but heavier than any other he had ever heard. His gaze and that of Igdal turned to the direction of the noise, trying to locate it despite the pain. A giant was approaching, all the survivors of the battle creeping out of his way as he neared Malone and Igdal. Towering far above the tallest men present, he was clad in metal covered his body entirely and, under the light of the dying fire, appeared green. His head was similarly encased, with 2 points of red light where the eyes should have been. He held in his hand a weapon similar to the one that the enemy chief had wielded, but far bigger, and yet he seemed able to hold it in one hand. At his hip hung another weapon that Malone couldn't identify. It looked like a blade, but was covered in smaller bits of metal, like teeth. All of his instincts screamed at Malone that the being was dangerous, and when he saw what was depicted on its shoulder, he was terrified. For the giant bore the mark of the multi-headed dragon, and this creature appeared in only one kind of story, those about the fallen one. An angel stood before him, the one who had plunged his world into the dark and was responsible for all that had happened since. Anger rose in him, banishing his fear. With an wordless snarl, he jumped at the giant, his axe risen. Part of him knew that he didn't stand a chance of killing or even hurting an angel, but he didn't care. He wanted revenge for all that had been done to the land, and he would either have it or die. Behind him, he heard Igdal's warning shout, but he didn't listen to the words. Before he could make 3 steps, something hit him at the back of his head, and he fell on the ground. The last thing he saw before falling unconscious was Igdal dropping his club and seizing him before he hit the stones beneath them, and the last thought that crossed his mind was, why had his friend hit him? Clever, said Chikaris, his voice hissing because of the deformation of his tongue. You knew I would kill him if he attacked me, so you prevented him from doing so, even if that meant attacking your own friend. Quick thinking. The boy looked up at him, his eyes filled with the same anger that had filled those of his friend, but colder and contained. Good. The boys could hate him if they wanted. In fact, this would give them purpose, and the strength to survive the implantation procedures. It would be dangerous for him once they were transformed into Astartes, but by then it would be a wonder if anything remained of their former personalities. You want to kill me too, don't you? Asked Chikaris. I can see it in your eyes. The young human didn't move an inch, nor did his expression change. Chikaris continued. But you cannot kill me as you are. You are too weak. You know that. He gestured at the rest of the humans, still petrified in fear and awe. None of you here have the strength to kill me, but I could give it to you. My lord and master needs warriors, soldiers to fight in his wars against the false god who has betrayed us all. If you were to join his armies, he would give you the same power I possess, and, in time, you may be able to claim vengeance, if you still desire it. Now, tell me, boy, what do you want? To die here, on this worthless planet, forgotten by all? Or to break free, to see the universe beyond this cover of darkness? To see the stars and travel through them as one of the strongest warriors of the galaxy, free to impose his will over all and having nothing to fear? Make your choice, boy. Cold and dark. Those were the first 2 things that Malone felt when he woke up. Then he opened his eyes, and it wasn't dark anymore. It was so bright, in fact, that he shut his eyes back closed, the light burning them. A few seconds later, he looked again, eyes only half open. He was laying on a metal floor, with a metal roof a few meters above his head. That was new. He knew what a roof was. He had heard the description of houses from the elders, and the shelters they built had one. But he had never actually seen one so clearly made to last longer than just a few cycles. Where am I? He groaned. Then the memory of what had happened hit him. He had attacked the fallen one, and Igdal had struck him down from behind before he could try to strike at the giant. Of course, looking back, without the rage of the battle to obscure his thoughts, he could understand why his friend had done so, but... Awake, at last? Get up, Malone. Now. The voice of his friend, here? And why was it filled with such urgency? Malone forced himself up, and saw that Igdal was standing near him, facing something like 20 other boys the same age as them. There was hostility in their eyes, not true anger, simply the reflex hostility of animals who instinctively knew they were in competition with each other. It wasn't hard to imagine what had happened. They had seen Malone unconscious and had wanted to finish what Igdal had started before he could wake up. "Where are we?" asked Malone again. His voice sore. The room was broad, several hundred paces broad, and walls of metal closed all around them. Igdal and him were near one of the wall, their back turned toward it while they faced the other youngsters. More of them were staying away from the confrontation. Malone estimated their number to several hundred, at least. He had never seen so many people gathered in one place. Some of them looked like people of the land, pale skin and broad eyes, and others were of complexion and aspect unlike anything he had ever seen before. "We aren't in the land anymore, Malone," answered Igdal to Malone's question. It took a second to the lad to remember what it was he had asked. The Fallen One called his brothers, and they took us, and them too, with him. "What? Then where are we?" "Beyond the dark. On a floating city, that sails the void between the shining daughters." Snarled one of the others. "Ignorant primitives. We are aboard the Hand of Ruin, you idiot. The ship of Lord Arkan the Awakened One, commander of the Forsaken Sons." "Who the hell are you to speak to us like that?" asked Igdal, his voice dangerously calm. The other young man, who wore clothes more colored and in better state, if still a bit dirty, than anything Malone had ever seen, spoke arrogantly. "I am Radomir Sertanov, scion of the House Sertanov, lords and masters of the world of Mula Prime, and future warrior of the Forsaken Sons. Although it is more than a bit insulting to see that I am put with wretches like you." Anger rose again in Malone's chest. He groaned threateningly, and began to walk toward the source of his rage, but Igdal held him back, his arms stretched to block his path, his head moving slowly from left to right. Understanding his friend's wordless message, Malone forced himself to calm down. He looked at Igdal, and asked, "Why did the Fallen One's brothers brought us here?" "They want us to join them, Malone. The Fallen One told me that he had waited long for worthy subjects, whatever that means." "How did we end up here?" "After I clubbed you. Sorry about that, by the way. The Fallen One asked me if I wanted revenge against him too. He told me that we could get it if we came with him, that his lord would share his power with us and that we would be the Fallen One's equals. I accepted his offer." "You were right to do so," said Malone, his voice dripping with hatred as more and more memories returned to him. "That bastard must pay, whatever the price." "What happened next?" "The Fallen One did something. I don't know why. Then a great thing came from the sky, with the Fallen One's kindred in its belly, and it took us away. We traveled through the land, faster than anything, and when we stopped, the Fallen One and his brothers went and came back with more guys. Finally, they gave us all something to drink that made us fall asleep, and when my eyes opened, we were here with these guys." "So, we are going to become angels?" "Not angels, you ignorant, brain-dead fool," spat Radomir. "Astartes. Perfect warriors, carrying the blood of the divine and the favor of the true gods." Malone looked at the arrogant son of Stalker again. This one, he decided, wasn't going to live long. "A most impressive batch, I must admit, Jacaerus." "Thank you, my lord," said the apothecary, bowing before Arkan. The two Astartes were watching the aspirants from another room, using cameras to survey their actions. Other Fleshmasters were reading documents and reports about the analysis that had been conducted on the humans while they were sedated, searching for signs that would announce incompatibility. So far, they hadn't found anything in those they had brought from Mula Secundus. "What about you? Are you all right? You said you were down there for decades. Did anything happen to you, brother?" Jacaerus hesitated. Should he confess his mutations? Yet again, it wasn't as if he would be able to conceal them forever. And he doubted the Awakened One would kill him simply because of that. He was too calculating to throw away an asset that had proved its value. "Some changes in my flesh and armor," he admitted. "Nothing too important to prevent me from functioning at full ability." "Good. What you have done is truly impressive, Jacaerus. I will need your services again in the future, though I will try to make sure it isn't as taxing for you as it was with this instance." For several minutes, The two Marines stood silent, watching as the aspirants played a game as old as life itself, the game of influence and intimidation that occurred whenever pack animals were suddenly together. Finally, Jacaerus asked, "What will we do now, my lord? We have taken everything we could from this system. Where are we going next?" Arkan didn't speak for a few seconds, and Jacaerus feared that he had spoken out of station. Then the Awakened One answered. "To another system, some 10 weeks of warp travel away. It is called Paraxis. Plus Imperial Record 248 Z94 Azab 666 plus. Plus Paraxis System plus. Plus Worlds, Paraxis Alpha, Hive World, Paraxis Beta, Garrison World, Paraxis Gamma, Penal World plus. Plus population, approximately 14 billion, records from the local Adeptus Administratum, address eventual complaints accordingly plus. Plus notable assets, defensive orbital platforms around Paraxis Beta, orbital construction docks around Paraxis Alpha, terraformed moon of Paraxis Alpha for the highest members of the Society's recreation plus. Plus defenses, access refused. Refer to Directive MLA 212,871,647 for further information about data quarantinement plus. Plus access to this report is reserved to those with a magenta level clearance only plus. Plus the Emperor protects plus. Captain and Acting Fleet Admiral Oswald Von Libestat was a man of great calm and temperance. For the entirety of the 70 years he had spent in the Imperial Navy, he had been a model officer, rising from his position as mere lieutenant to the command of his own ship, the Maleficence's Reward. He had fought in dozens of void engagements, including the pacification of the Paraxis system, and earned his own command in that battle, and no small command either, an Apocalypse-class battleship, produced by the newly built orbital docks of the recently freed system. The Battle of Paraxis, he remembered fondly even in these dark times, had been a good war. For weeks, the Imperial fleet had battled the ships of the Paraxisian Xenos overlords, until boarding actions by the Ultramarines had taken down the enemy's admiral's ship. By that single action, the Astartes had tipped the scales of the campaign in the Imperium's favor. The rest of the Xenos fleet had tried to flee, and less than 10 ships out of a fleet that had once counted close to 100 had succeeded. It had been a glorious victory for the Imperial Navy, though Oswald knew that many of his colleagues regretted that they had needed the help of the Space Marines. Foolishness, Oswald had thought. The Adeptus Astartes was the arm of the Emperor, the instrument of his will across the galaxy just as surely as the Navy itself, or the Imperial Guard, perhaps even more so. Were the Space Marines not the children of his own sons, the Primarchs? Did their hearts not pump through their enhanced bodies his sacred blood? That the progeny of the Divine Emperor had fought side by side with mere mortal like them had been an honor. As a believer of the Lectitio Divinatis, albeit he had kept his faith a secret until he had thought the men and women under his command could benefit from it, Oswald von Libestat had considered himself blessed to be able to watch such peerless warriors in action. Then the heresy had come, and the galaxy had screamed while hope and the future burned in the flames of betrayal. The best and brightest son of him on Earth had turned from his father, pushed to this unthinkable act by the darkest powers of the galaxy, the archdemons of the warp, the abominations that those they had enslaved called the dark gods of chaos. Horus Lupercal, some said, had destroyed the Imperium even in his ultimate defeat. The Emperor wasn't dead, may he live forever, but he had been crippled by his corrupted son. The traitor legions were defeated, but they weren't destroyed. The war was over. But there had been no victor. Of that, Oswald was bitterly certain. They had all lost. And now, in the darkness of an uncertain future, only his faith in the Emperor prevented him from simply crying himself to death over all that had been lost. His faith that the Lord of Mankind had a plan that could save them all, even in this disaster that was the aftermath of the Horus heresy. The other thing that had kept him alive, literally, he had seen dozens of men and women, all competent and solid members of his crew, simply wasting away after the War Master's death. Despair finally overwhelming them at the magnitude of the destruction, had been his duty. Duty to the Emperor, to the Imperium, and, he was not afraid to admit it, to those under his command. They had all fought with him during the war, in engagements that wouldn't be remembered against traitorous elements of the Navy, and while part of him was sad that their heroism wouldn't be remembered, another was glad that there would be no trace of these stains upon the institution's honor. He had a duty to them, to lead them, to give them purpose. That was his duty, the task that the Emperor had intended for him in his great wisdom. Oswald had shared his faith with his crew, and it had spread to the rest of the fleet. It had given hope, it had given strength. When word of the rebellion had first reached them, it had been under the form of the betrayal of half the fleet, suddenly opening fire on the ships whose commanders they knew wouldn't join the Warmaster. The fleet admiral had died in the first moments of the battle, his Emperor-class battleship loyalties due lost to the traitors' combined fire as he bought time for the rest of the loyalists to escape. Oswald, as the highest-ranked surviving officer, had taken command of the remnants of the fleet. At the time, he had 24 ships under his command, in various state of damage. He had led them into battle, fighting short, bloody raids against the traitors' supply lines or isolated ships, joining other pockets of loyalist forces en route to other zones of the war for brief contact, exchanges of news and information, and the occasional battle together. He had fought in more battle during the years of the heresy that he had had in the rest of his life, all across the Trebadius sector. When the news of Horus' death had arrived, his fleet had been down to 12 ships. Wounded, tired, and victorious by some far-stretched definition of the word, he had returned to the Paraxis system. Thankfully, the system had remained loyal, a fact that, Oswald suspected, had much to do with the fact that it had been freed by the 13th Legion. It had also gone relatively unscathed, and the orbital docks, once they had established their identity and loyalty to the throne, had welcomed them for repairs. At the beginning of the war, proving their loyalty would have been quite a conundrum. But now, things were different. The traitor ships had been changed by those who commanded them. In hindsight, it was obviously the touch of chaos, spreading from the souls of those who had sided with the arch-traitor to the very metal. All the fleet had had to do to prove its loyalty had been to allow envoys to come aboard and examine the ships. Then, just as it had seemed that calm and order were finally settling back into the galaxy, with the loyal legions purging the Imperium from the traitors' presence, a warp storm had engulfed them. He had lost 4 more ships in the first moments of it, the Psychers aboard going mad and bursting from within, unleashing beasts from the Immaterium, before ordering all remaining ships to keep their Geller fields on at all times. From what their astropaths and navigators could see, the warp storm had taken all of the Trebadius sector within it. They were cut off from the rest of the Imperium, and even within the Strom communication and warp travel were all but impossible. Fortunately, the Paraxis system was self-sustained, with the ships of the fleet to ensure that the different production from each world was brought to the others. Promethium from the penal labor camps on Paraxis Gamma, manufactured goods and food rations from the recycling industries of Paraxis Alpha, and the forces needed to preserve order from Paraxis Beta. They had fought back the riots that had broken out in the streets, crushed the rebellion in Paraxis Gamma, and hunted down the cults of chaos that had sprung out like bad weeds. They would endure this storm, Oswald had promised to the fleet and the other responsibles of the system. As commander of the only way to travel and carry messages to other worlds, astropaths were no longer reliable, most of them had been put down and the rest were isolated. Oswald had effectively become the military governor of the Paraxis system in all but name. His name and face had been broadcast throughout the system, his voice and words used to calm down a population that, now that it seemed the Emperor couldn't reach them anymore, was starting to panic. He had told them that it wasn't true, that the Emperor had provided them with all they needed to weather the storm. The only thing he hadn't given them was courage, for it was something they had to find within themselves. Those had been fine words, and he had even believed in them. Now, however, despite how blasphemous the thought was, even he was beginning to doubt that the Emperor had foreseen what would befell them. He had lost another ship to the demons, and most of the Psychers that had been on board were dead. There had been rebellions on 3 other vessels, thankfully put down before anything important could be damaged, but they had still lost thousands of crew members. And now, this. "Are you certain?" he asked to the holopic transmitting the image and words of the last astropath alive he had aboard his ship. The blind, desiccated man nodded once, before starting to ramble again. "The storm pushes them toward us, and those who guide them ride it as we would ride the void. Powerful presences dwell within the beast, one bearing a thirst of blood that would destroy the stars, one who is prisoner yet whose words go freely, and another, oh, the other, different, yet so much more dangerous, so much hatred, so much evil. He comes. Death has come for us all. Get a hold of yourself, Mathus," ordered Oslo, focusing every ounce of command he possessed into his words. He couldn't afford to lose the astropath now. The veil between reality and the immaterium was thin in a warp storm, but it was still here. An astropath could feel when it was about to be pierced, and that information had been priceless in repulsing several demonic incursions in the last months. Throne. Demonic. How easily even he had fallen back into such superstitious terms and beliefs when the galaxy had stopped to correspond to his views. Yes. Forgive me, my lord. It is simply too much. The storm, it recognizes them, Oslo. It knows them, and it has affection? No, this isn't the right word. Gratitude? No, it isn't either. Jealousy, envy, hatred, hunger, thirst, protection, partnership. There is no word in Gothic for what it feels. Feels? Mathus, are you implying that the warp storm is sentient, somehow? The image of the astropath smiled in response, an ugly thing born of utter terror and forming madness. Of course it is. So much emotion, in the warp, gains a life of its own. The souls of the dead were used in its birth, gathered by the sons of the first heretic and sacrificed by the hand of he who never sleeps, and it hates all things, but it hates us even more. Oh yes it does. The link cut off abruptly, and Oslo let out a stream of curses before shouting at his aides. Contact the guards of the astropathic chamber. Possible contamination. Get in and prepare to purge it if needed. The men guarding the room were the most competent and ruthless he had under his command. Members of the Navy's own troops, they had fought backboarding from Xenos and traitors alike, and they had never failed him. Yet even them, he knew, would have a hard time dealing with the demon, if such a thing was possible at all. So, for the sake of the soldiers as well as the old astropaths, he hoped that Mathus was simply having a fit of dementia. However, before he received any report on what had happened to the blinded psyker, alarms rose from almost every console on the deck. It appeared Mathus' warning, as confused as it may have been, was nonetheless correct. In a maneuver that they had performed a lot of times during the war, all operators on deck cut off the alarms and focused on whatever their screens were telling them. A few seconds later, just before Oswald ordered a full report to be given to him, Sega, his second-in-command, rose and delivered it. A single ship has just emerged from the warp, sir. It is still at the border of the system. At its current speed, it should reach engaging distance in 2 hours. Identification? The Hand of Ruin of the Legion Astartes, 16th Legion, sir, finished the man before Oswald could ask. A model that I have never seen before, but it's twice as big as us and probably filled with traitors. The bastard progeny of Horus himself, spat the Admiral. Is there any problem with the rest of the fleet? No, sir. Then bring every ship in formation to intercept, and patch me through this treacherous dog's vox. I want to speak with whoever is at its command. An image of the enemy ship appeared on the hololith before Oswald. It was a dreadful thing indeed. It had clearly just been repaired, the steel of its side was unevenly damaged by time and battle. Countless weapons pointed out of its frame, from short-range turrets to take down enemy fighters to giant cannons the size of a building that could spat plasma or send oversized ordnance through the void. The ship looked like a lone predator, akin to a tiger or a shark, but it lacked the inner nobility of these beasts in Oswald's eyes, instead looking twisted, somehow. The old man didn't know what it must feel to be connected to the machine spirit of such a vessel, but he doubted it was an agreeable experience. The name of the ship, Hand of Ruin, as Sega had said, was engraved on its side in gold letters 100 meters high, and beneath it was depicted the image of a horned skull surrounded by a circle of unbroken chain. Whatever foul imagery was at work here, Oswald didn't want to know. He was drawn away from his examination, after only a few seconds had passed, by Sega's voice. They are already hailing us, sir. Audio transmission. Open it, then. Standard Protocol. The Standard Protocol was something the fleet's officers had devised after losing an entire ship to one of the enemy's most vile sorceries. When the captain of the Purity of Will had tried to contact a traitor Adeptus Mechanicus craft to convince it to surrender, a noble gesture, but a foolish one, they had sent in reply sounds that had somehow driven his entire command crew, himself included, mad. Now, when attempting communication with traitor ships, only the captain himself could hear whatever passed through the channel, and the second-in-command had a gun pointed at his or her superior's head during all that time. Paranoid, probably. But in the aftermath of the Horus heresy, those who weren't paranoid were dead. This is Admiral Oswald von Libestat, commander of the Maleficence's reward. In the name of the Emperor, identify yourself, traitor. There was a moment of static-filled silence, then the reply came, delivered in the low tones of an Astartes, yet sounding utterly devoid of emotion and feeling. This was the voice of a corpse, thought Oswald for a moment, before suddenly detecting the hatred beneath the apparent calmness. At that moment, the pious captain knew that he was speaking to the third entity Mathus had referred to. This is Commander Arkan, former commander of the Sons of Horus, now master of the Forsaken Sons. I will give you one chance to surrender, Admiral. Turn off your ship's engines, drop your shields, and let my men come aboard. Do all this, and you and your crew may live. You may even fight yet another battle, though it would be after you had the lies of the false emperor exposed to you. Oswald snarled. Did that heretic thought that he would accept his offer? Most probably not, he decided. This was a taunt, nothing more, made to drive him to make mistakes due to anger. Well, two could play that game, and Oswald had sharpened his skills. Officers who had sided with the War Master, he had noticed, tended to have short tempers and big egos. It was probably those traits that had made them vulnerable to the arch-traitor's whispers in the first place, and they had only grown worse after their betrayal. I will make you another offer, traitor. Drop your shields and I will grant that hideous piece of garbage that you call a ship and all those who dwell within its putrid bowels a quick death. You cannot prevail, Admiral. This is the hand of ruin. We have fought against the Warborn and the forces of terror themselves, and we have survived. What make you think that you will succeed where they failed? My faith in the Emperor is all I need to prevail, heretic. For the first time, Oswald heard a bit of emotion creep into the traitor Marine's voice, anger threatening to break the illusion of calm as he spoke. Faith? What do you know of faith, old man? The one whose name you so foolishly invokes isn't a god. He is nothing but a liar and a deceiver, a traitor who sacrificed his own blood sons to fight and die in his stance while he plotted his ascension, ready to leave us alone in a galaxy that hate us. We are not traitor, mortal. We are the only ones who have seen the truth, that there are true gods in this galaxy, and that only by embracing them can mankind survive. Cling to the false hope of your so-called faith for as long as you can. We will see if it endures when I toss your souls to the demons. I will take your ships as my own, and your men will bow before the Octid. The priests of the Pantheon will turn them to the primordial truth, and those who are too blind to see it will feed the dark god's appetite. The communication cut off on these last, ominous words. For a moment, Oswald looked into empty air, before turning towards Sega. Pleased to see that the man was still targeting him, he simply said, "Contact all ships. Tell them to be prepared to repel boarders. And tell the Oblivion's Keeper, you know what to tell them. I hear the whisper of the demon in my blood. I stand at the center of a circle traced in blood, the scent of which makes my thirst grows. Those of the Coven watch over me, feeling the power I possess and afraid I will use it against them. They're a right to be scared. Hekaran wants me to kill them. But Arkan is here, too. His presence forces the beast down. It is scared of him, of what he can do to it with the knowledge he possesses. There are several more circles, 7 more of them. A total of 8 circles have been drawn, and me and the demon can feel the approval of the blood god at such an auspicious number. Each circle is occupied by warriors of the Forsaken Sons, 100 for every arcane device. In a moment, the sorcerers will begin the ritual. They will tear open the Empyrean, and forge a way through reality and madness to our destinations, the vessels of those who dare to oppose our Lord. Each of the groups of warriors has been given specific battle orders by Arkan as to how capture the ship, and a small token of sorcery to use if they need to be dragged back to the hand of ruin. I know that most of them wouldn't use it, preferring death to the shame of failure, but Arkan has been clear. He wants his warriors to come back, if only so that he can punish them himself should they have been truly incompetent. He has warned that he will ask the Coven to capture and torture the souls of any who would choose death over facing him. I haven't received a token, for my nature makes it simple for the sorcerers to hone their magics on my position, simple, but not easy, as I am also resistant to their tricks. My mission is simple, for the ship I will be sent to is one that has been condemned to death. Find the commander of the ship, and of the entire fleet, kill him and all the command crew, then call for the Coven to pull back me and the rest of my assault group so that the Hand of Ruin can tear apart the ship freely. At least, that is the plan. Even one such as I knows that no plan ever survive contact with the enemy. My finger claws itch with the desire to plunge them into flesh, but I contain it, for now. There is no enemy here, or is there? With me in the one circle I occupy are those I once called brothers, warriors of the 12th Legion. Now I have no more brothers, and the demon has shown me my legion's fate, broken, scattered across the stars by the most unthinkable betrayal. I am tainted, twisted, a parody of what I once was. So are they. They admire me for my strength, for the power I wield. They are wrong. I am damned. And so are they. But at least they don't know it. They know so little these days. How to fight, that they will never forget. That Archon is their lord, that I wonder when they will forget. That the Imperium is their enemy, that, I think some have already forgotten. That they are sons of Angron. That, they wish they could forget. The presence of the other Astartes irritates me. It makes me want to kill them. I see some of them wearing the purple and gold of the 3rd Legion, and it makes the demon screams in anger and disgust. I share both of these emotions, did even before we became one. The Emperor's children are pathetic, they always were, but now they are monstrous even by the standards of what we have become. Strong, yes, but they waste their might on the pursuit of petty satisfactions and pleasures, ignoring the higher call, the call for blood. Ah, here it is again. I no longer feel the butcher's nails in my head. The demon has removed the pain. Now, it and I thirst. We thirst for blood, for the sensation of splitting skulls and rending flesh. It has been too long since we last fought, and the thirst has grown. It is painful, but it is not like the nails. It isn't driving me insane. I am in control. That is the worst part, I think. Regardless of what I do to slake the thirst, it is I that do it. Not the nails. Not the rage. Not the demon. My name is Hector. I cling to that name. It is all that prevent despair from overcoming me, and if that happens then the demon will take me wholly. I am Hector. I am Hector. I am. You are my host. You are my brother. You are the blood god's servant. Yes. I am that as well. To many, a battle in space is a thing of beauty. To others, it is the business of cowards lacking the guts to face their foes on a blood-soaked battlefield, a weapon in their hand. Regardless of these biased points of view, one thing remains undeniably true: space battle is huge. The ships trading volleys are often tens of thousands of kilometers away from each other, and even with the speed and maneuverability that mankind's greatest minds conferred to the vessels, aiming and placing is a matter of cold calculus and anticipation. Reflexes and quick thinking are useless when shots can take up to an hour to cross the determined course of their target. It was, in many ways, war at its most civilized, most clean and most totally unforgiving. One shot reaching its target means hundreds of lives lost, not just in the impact but as the cold of the void penetrates the hull of the victim. A single mistake from one of the thousands of crew involved could have catastrophic consequences. It was for a reason that the Imperial Navy only recruited the best of the best, except for the poor souls that dwelled in the ship's depths, and were sentenced to carry on repeating but necessary tasks for the engines to keep working. At the Battle for Paraxis, the Imperial ships had the advantages of a combined superior firepower, efficient crew, and an ability to work together honed by all the battles they had fought under Admiral von Libestat. The enemy had Astartes. Never before had they faced that, but they knew what the legionaries were capable of, having seen them in action during the bygone days of the Great Crusade. And what the mortals commanding the Loyalist ships knew was enough to make them doubt that victory was even possible. Space Marines were the ultimate boarding forces, their natural talent for spearheading an assault magnified in the confines of a ship. Analysis of the enemy ship's design revealed it had been made from the earlier model of the Adeptus Astartes mighty battle barges that composed the core of the Legion's fleets, but bigger, capable of hosting thousands of surhuman warriors. Oswald doubted that it was full. After all, every Legion, traitor or loyalist, had sustained terrible losses during the heresy. Some more than the rest, it was true. Oswald's heart still bled whenever he thought of the fate of the noble Salamanders, Iron Hands, and Raven Guards. These had been arguably the most humane of the legions, and now, weak as they were, they would be unable to wait on the future of the Imperium. Dark times were ahead, that was for certain. All ships, be prepared to repel boarders, he repeated his order. He trusted the other crews, but he needed to make sure they had received the message. Even if we haven't detected any boarding craft being launched, it doesn't mean that there isn't any we fail to see. The Hand of Ruin advanced fearlessly toward the Imperial fleet, its weapons ready to fire the moment it reached their maximum range. On the deck of the Astartes vessel, Shipmaster Koldak was smiling. He loved Void War. He had seen many battles during his service to the 16th Legion, and he had come to seek the perfect battle, the one where every participant would play his part flawlessly so that only pure, unaltered strategy would determine the victor. The Siege of Terra had been a wonder of tactical prowess, until the impossible-to-understand decision of the Warmaster to lower the Vengeful Spirit's shields and allow the false Emperor to teleport aboard. Now, facing a fleet that had so clearly fought many battles together, Koldak reveled in the opportunity to test his mettle against such worthy opponents. Oh, sure, the battle would actually be concluded by the Astartes about to be sent to the enemy ships by the Coven's unknowable sorcery, but until the warriors finished their tasks, it would be up to Koldak and his crew to keep the Hand of Ruin intact and close enough to all ships for the Coven to be able to pull back the boarders if the ship they were on was deemed lost. Such a challenge was unprecedented in all of his career, and in fact, possibly in all the history of space navigation. It made his blood boil with anticipation. The enemy commander, Admiral von Libestat, if he remembered correctly, had sounded like a courageous man in his talk with the Awakened One, although a foolish one. No one could stand against Lord Archon. He had dragged the entire ship through hell, captured and enslaved a Lord of the Demons, and unleashed a power beyond the imagining of mortals across an entire sector. Who could challenge such a being? He reminded Koldak of the Warmaster. After all, he too had united Astartes from different legions toward one purpose. And that loyalist had dared to insult him. He would soon understand his error, of that Koldak was certain. Too bad it would probably means his death. The Blood Champion, as he had come to be called in frightened whispers, was not a subtle weapon, if a powerful one. How long until we reach the teleporting range? He asked, already knowing the answer, but it never hurt to confirm his own estimations with the arguably more precise cogitators of the ship. 5 minutes and 26 seconds, sir, answered one of the officers. 115 seconds sooner than he had anticipated. Good. The deck of the Hand of Ruin had changed more than a bit since its change of allegiance, and even more so since the Exodus. They had been reached by Walkborn a total of 3 times during their run through the Empyrean, and the damage the demons had done had just been repaired. The tech priests had incorporated some of the new designs thought by Mercurian, and the result had been a lot more of biotechnology being used, combined with some downright creepy things like mutated servitors and organic screens. But it worked, and that was all that mattered, whether it was powered by the blessings of the Omnissiah or the wonders of the Dark Gods. Any word from the esteemed Awakened One? None, sir. Perfect. That meant Lord Archon had finished his briefings of the assault groups and was ready to see them off to battle without any delay. Koldak was still a bit doubtful about the new method of boarding they would use. It seemed to him that the Coven's craft was too much alike the horrors they had faced during the Exodus. But if Lord Archon thought it best, still, unlike most of his crew, the shipmaster wasn't quite a devout of the true pantheon. He knew the gods the word-bearers spoke of were real. Of course, he wasn't a fool. And he also admitted that, in their circumstances, they had to take help wherever it came from. And yet, it was true that some of the changes the ruinous powers had wrought were unnerving. The Blood Champion was terrifying, of course, but the warriors who had once been battle brothers of the Emperor's children were the ones who truly disturbed him. He knew that some of their members aboard the Hand of Ruin were about to be sent to the Imperial ships. In spite of himself, he felt a tingle of pity for those who were about to face them. Ah, foolishness. He had to banish such thoughts, and focus on the incoming battle. Failure from his part would mean that the Hand of Ruin would take more damage that was absolutely unavoidable, and it could also mean the needless death of valuable Astartes. He didn't know how the Awakened One would balance the lives of Space Marines and damage to the ship, and he would rather not discover it. Lord Archon had been a comprehensive and reasonable commander so far, unlike many he had heard about in the rest of the legions. Apparently, those who had cast off the yoke of the false emperor had a tendency to be more liberal with the lives of the mortals under their command, but it was safer not to push the limits of his tolerance. 30 seconds to teleport, announced one of the servitors, transmitting the message from the chamber where Lord Archon couldn't communicate by Vox without risk of perturbing the ritual. "Well, ladies and gentlemen," said Koldak to his crew with a wild grin, "this is it. Let's give them hell until the Astartes finish their part of the job, shall we?" His words were received with a mix of cheer and salute, and the crew focused on their duties once more, ready to fight yet another battle in a war that would never end, against a foe just as dedicated to their task as they were. This was why he had sided with the Warmaster when the time had come for every human in the galaxy to pick a choice. The Emperor had forsaken the men who had fought and died to conquer the stars in his name, leaving what they had built in the hands of weaklings and bureaucrats that squandered the sacrifices that had been made. How could men and women who had never even seen a battlefield lead mankind? The galaxy was filled with Xenos who only wished to do it harm, and other horrors lurked amidst the stars that they couldn't even begin to imagine. The Warmaster had seen that, and he had even managed to forge an alliance with the greatest of these horrors, the Dark Gods of Chaos. He may have failed at the ultimate moment, but Koldak knew that Horus Lupercal had been in the right when he had called all those who were loyal to him to rebellion against the throne. Those who stood against them were blind to that truth. They thought the false emperor was protecting them, but how, when he had abandoned the Great Crusade? When he had conspired to leave mankind alone so that he could focus on planning his ascension to godhood? And now some of these fools even worshipped him. That was beyond his understanding. The false emperor wasn't a god. There were true gods in the galaxy, and yet they would cling to a false idol rather than embrace them. Foolishness. And for that foolishness, they would die. Well, the lucky ones anyway. The sensation of having one's very being torn apart by the mighty energies of the warp, decided Tacitus, was a definitely new experience, and thus one that had to be savored. The sounds he was sure he had heard during the transition had been truly marvelous, the symphony of the Empyrean, singing with the pleas of the damned and the dirge of the lost. Nevertheless, even for a devoted of the Dark Prince such as him, being teleported across thousands of kilometers by means that had not been tested still hurt. Looking around him with eyes which could never be closed, thanks to the eyelids having been removed by the scalpels of the 3rd Legion's apothecaries, Tacitus saw the rest of the assault group materialize as well. Other members of the Emperor's children appeared. All of them were wielding the sonic blasters they had fabricated from the bones and sinew of men and women sacrificed to the Lord of Pleasure, and weapons that had once been bolters now transformed beyond the imagination of most humans. 2 packs of Tacitus brothers took part in the boarding, 18 warriors of the only legion who had reached perfection in the Dark Prince's embrace. Of all of them, only Tacitus didn't carry one of the sonic blasters. His own approach to battle, and passion, was different, and, he firmly believed, superior. The other part of the assault group, 3 packs of former word-bearers, emerged as well. To Tacitus' surprise and delight, one of the crude, boring warrior monks was unfortunate enough to appear in the middle of a steel wall, his body cut apart as it manifested. The blood of the legionary erupted in a geyser that covered the armor of his brothers, combining with the crimson color of their heraldry in a way Tacitus found exquisite. He could smell the rich, coppery scent of Astartes' blood, and wanted to taste it on his tongue. He could feel the same impulse in the rest of his pack, their minds feeling a pang of anticipated pleasure at the simple thought. But he held back, and they followed his example. Turning on their allies so soon in their mission would be foolish. It could lead to failure, and failure would end into death. And while Tacitus and his brothers didn't fear death, it was, after all, the ultimate experience. They would rather only meet it after enjoying the galaxy's worth of sensations all they could. So, still suppressing the wonderful impulse, Tacitus greeted his allies. "Brothers, it seems the Coven succeeded in the task our Lord assigned it, though not without cost." Tacitus' vocal cords had been modified too, in a way such as to make the pitch of his voice shift randomly, sending pulses of sensations into his brain and that of his brethren with each unexpected change. It seemed the word-bearers didn't enjoy such a refined pleasure, though, for they looked back at him all at once, save for the one who was retrieving the dead warrior's gene seed. The former emperor's children could feel the contempt in their gaze. "Get silent, freak," growled back one of the warriors in crimson ceramite. "We have a mission to complete." For a moment, the desire to plunge his blade, a magnificent weapon crafted from the bones of legionaries fallen on Istvan V and metal plundered from their tanks, into the fanatic's head to punish him for his insult was almost impossible to suppress, but Tacitus simply nodded, and turned to lead his brothers toward their objective. The Awakened One had assigned different targets to the two groups, probably in order to avoid precisely what had almost happened. Tacitus would have admired Darkin's insight if it hadn't deprived him of the chance to kill one of the word-bearers by accident. They ran through the corridors of the ship, empty of all life. The fleet they were engaging had taken heavy losses in the war, that much was obvious, and the crew that remained was doubtlessly concentrated to the areas of utmost necessity. It was the same procedure that had been applied on the Hand of Ruin. This ship, however, was different. Tacitus couldn't tell what exactly, but there was a fundamental difference between this ship, the Oblivion's Keeper, if he remembered correctly, and the Hand of Ruin. Was it something as simple as the fact that this one had never turned side? Did the loyalty of those aboard, misguided and foolish as it was, have the power to cause such an unsettling air? No, it was something else. Something deeper, more primal. This ship was simply plain. It lacked the marvelous taint that had infected the Hand of Ruin during the Exodus, the palpable sense of power and corruption that had penetrated the vessel. It was, in a word, boring. And nothing was more anathema to a devotee of the Dark Prince than boredom. When the ship was theirs, Tacitus decided, they would have to change that. Perhaps he could ask the Awakened One to give them some of the people of this system's worlds to be used as the material for the ship's redecorating. The Emperor's children had made such wonders of the people of Terra, who knew what they could achieve with more time that they had had there. But that would have to wait. For now, there was killing to enjoy. His group was directed toward the engineering while the Sons of Lorga were to take control of the command deck. There was a lot more personnel working on the engines, and no doubt the Awakened One would understand if some of them were to be killed in the confusion of the assault, despite their potential value if they could be turned. Machine Spirit, once more we call upon your blessing. Please, grant us speed, so that we may face the enemies of man. Please, grant us strength, that we may destroy them. Please, grant us resilience, that we may endure in your service. The prayer was older than Leximus, indeed, older than his entire flesh line. It came from the first techno-masters from Holy Mars itself, when they had embraced the truth of the machine god after the horrors of the Dark Age of technology. It was effective, though. The engines of the Oblivion's Keeper roared in answer to the tech priest's supplication, the cough that had been impairing them forgotten. The engines of the ship were massive, surrounding a power generator that used the litanies of plasma fusion secrets to feed the titanic machineries all the way to the propulsors on the ship's exterior. Orders were transmitted from the command deck, received and put into the engines under the form of pulses of binary code. Complex maneuvers were translated in combinations of more power to some parts of the ship and less to others by the cogitators implanted within the servitors dedicated to the task. Leximus and the other tech priests listened to the commands with distract ears, their processors filtrating them so that they could anticipate which parts of the engines were going to need maintenance next. Warning, intrusion detected, warned one of the servitors in its monotonous voice. Warning, time esteemed before intruders break through defenses, 3.004 second. The servitor was interrupted by an explosion, and a splinter of metal cut it in two, spilling its fluids, blackened blood and oil alike, all around its station. Leximus and his brethren turned to face whatever had dared to intrude in their sanctuary, the weapons that were as much part of them as the other, more conventional implants, raised in preparation. There had been no guards on the door's other side, because anything that could pierce the 3 meters deep obstacle would have been more than capable of dealing with them. The tech priests, however, had prepared for battle for years, testing their most recent innovations in the many battles that had occurred aboard the ship during the Horus Heresy. Leximus had led them in the process. Indeed, he had been the first to suggest that they modify their own bodies, even though they didn't have permission from Mars to elevate themselves into the Holy Order of the Mechonicus. The Omnissiah, he had argued, would forgive such a minor violation of his creed if it was to better fight his enemies. He had been heard, and the 17 tech priests remaining in the engine room were each true killing machines, looking more like Scutari than engineers, but still able to fulfill their original duties. In the end, it had been decided that they would have to defend themselves, and the human soldiers used to defend more critical sections of the ship. It had been a temporary measure, to be ended as soon as they could get reinforcements from the rest of the system, but the transports that had been supposed to bring the new crew members aboard were still on the orbital docks. They would have to wait until the battle was over, obviously. The assailants poured through the broken door, and Leximus distractedly noted that the defense had been destroyed by the use of melter bombs and something which he couldn't identify. Then the tech priest saw what exactly the enemies were, and he felt something he took several milliseconds to identify: disgust. The creatures had the size of Astartes, and seemed to wear the colors of the traitorous Third Legion, though some of them had covered the shoulder symbol of their allegiance in black paint for reasons Leximus didn't even want to fathom, but all resemblance ended here. These were not space marines, though they had obviously been at some point. Their armor was covered in glyphs that offended Leximus' very core, as if they were against everything he had ever believed in. Most of the warriors went unhelmed, and their faces. By the Omnissiah's holy name, Leximus had seen some horrors during the heresy, but this, if anything, the fact that the changes had obviously been voluntary made them all the more unbearable to look at. The flesh of the things was distorted, the skin stretched and kept in place by crude sutures and needles. Some had had their ears removed, all had their eyes fixed open through various means, and despite Leximus' removal from the flesh, he could still see that they were all insane. Their mouths were forced open by metallic structures built into their jaws, and endless screams rose from their throat. His sensors detected a potent smell of chemicals of unidentifiable provenance running through the intruder's bloodstream, most of them which would have been enough to kill a mortal man on their own, and there were dozens of them. Even the Astartes' superior resilience had to be fighting a hard battle to keep the Emperor's children functioning, and it somehow offended Leximus. To see the extent of the Omnissiah's genius, only for it to be so crudely debased, it struck him as wrong. It was heretical. Blasphemous. The weapons carried by the creatures were just as bizarre. Most of them carried things that looked like musical instruments, but as if they had been crafted by a lunatic having only access to an abattoir for his materials. It was only when they turned it toward one of the few combat servitors the tech priest still had that Leximus even accepted the things could do any damage beyond their ugly appearance. The mechanized minion was crushed to pulp by sound waves that made even Leximus' augmented hearing organs screech with feedback. Some part of him still refused to accept that the strange devices could have any effect, but in front of evidence, he shut them down for the moment. He felt that his brethren were facing the same dilemma, and shared his decision with them in a binary pulse, convincing them to wait until they had dealt with the intruders before attending to this technological aberration. The renegades charged them, and the tech priests opened fire as one. The first salvo took 3 of the 18 assailants down, and the rest scattered, seeking cover behind the wonders of the Omnissiah. Immediately, Leximus and his colleagues went down the elevated position they had been occupying and started moving, their cogitators tracing the best patterns through the labyrinth of machines to reach their foes before their foul presence could desecrate this place any further. Not the most optimal move tactical-wise, but there were things even the relatively open-minded tech priests aboard the Oblivion's Keeper weren't willing to forsake in the name of efficiency. Besides, there were other command panels across the room, and if one of the heretics were to be possessed of some skill, there was no telling the damage he could cause to the ship. Leximus himself rushed toward one of these panels, where his sensors indicated that an heretic would soon reach. He had to protect the ship, and if that meant fighting an Astartes, however corrupted, alone, then so be it. Just as he had predicted, the second he entered the section of the room, the warrior in desecrated armor entered it from the opposite side. Unlike its brothers, the thing carried only a contact weapon, at least, that was what Leximus estimated it was. It looked like a chainsword, but it wasn't following any of the templates of the weapon that Leximus knew. It was, strangely beautiful, in fact. The handle was finely crafted in the whitest bone, the teeth on the blade caught the dancing light of the electric bulbs quite beautifully, and something worthing Leximus screamed, and he tore his attention away from the blade, feeling as if his inner circuits had been attacked by a malign program, which was, he realized, the sensation the unblessed referred to as nausea. Now that whatever forbidden technology had enabled it had failed, the glamour that had surrounded the sword was gone, and it looked exactly as it was, a monstrosity, crafted from an unholy combination of bones and metal. There was also something more to it, something he couldn't identify yet knew, somehow, was what the crew of the ship called witchcraft. Unscientific, perhaps, but the word fit, and phenomena warp-related capable of circumventing the laws of physics was a little too long, even for the Adeptus Mechanicum. The warrior in purple and gold launched himself toward Leximus, and the tech priest opened fire. His autocannon pierced the armor of the Astartes in several points, sending goblets of tainted blood all around, yet the warrior didn't drop dead as Leximus Calculus had told him he should have. Instead, he continued to charge, and before Leximus' puzzled mind could react, he had already reached him and begun to slash his sword to cut him apart. With reflexes that were just as augmented as the rest of his person, the tech priest jumped out of harm's way, but failed to dodge the attack completely. And when dealing with Astartes, even a glancing blow is enough to cripple. The blade rammed through his chest, severing 6 vital cables and destroying 5 augmentic organs at the same time that Leximus fired again. This time, it was enough. As the corrupted marine fell down, Leximus in a vox picked up a transmission from the command deck of the ship. It was garbled with interference and the poor state of his own systems, but the message was still clear enough. This is, command deck lost, initiate, destruct procedure, the Emperor protects. So, it had come to this, in the end. They had fought as hard as they could, but the ship was lost. Better to destroy it than to let it fall into the hands of the traitors. With the Omnissiah's grace, perhaps the rest of the fleet had fared better than them. Blood and oil dripping from his many wounds, Leximus forced his broken body to crawl toward the control panel. All it would take would be one single signal, and the reaction of the plasma reactor would cascade until the Oblivion's Keeper vanished into a burst of fire like the birth of a small star. In other ships, such a thing was normally made impossible by protections and safeties, but these had been long removed on the Keeper, as the crew had long known that a time could come in their service to the Imperium when death would be the better outcome. Leximus forced himself up, clinging to the console, and raised his hand, the one at the end of the only arm he had left. It was made of flesh, not yet replaced by an augmentic. It seemed strange, heretical even, and yet appropriate to him, that flesh would have endured when the metal in him had failed to the traitor's onslaught. Warnings flashed before his eyes as his systems neared absolute shutdown. Pain, that he thought he had long left behind, forced its way to his awareness. Blackness began to overcome him, but still he moved his hand. Then something pierced him from behind, and the pain finally overwhelmed him. His hand hung over the one button that would send the Oblivion's Keeper into nothingness, but he couldn't lower it. Looking down, he saw that he had been pierced with a blasphemous weapon that the traitor had wielded. He realized that he could hear the heavy, difficult breathing of the heretic behind him. With the cold certainty of absolute knowledge, Leximus knew that he was dead, and that he had failed in his ultimate duty. But that was impossible. How could the Emperor's children's warrior have endured such degree of corporal damage? Leximus knew about the Astartes' subhuman resilience, but this went even beyond such things. And the warrior was still going to die. What could possibly push him to do such a thing when his body lay torn and destroyed, his blood almost entirely spilled? "Why?" asked the tech priest, his vox speaker barely managing to spat the words. "Why do you go this far?" Emotion, that he thought he had been released from so long ago, crept into his voice, despite the fact that the speakers weren't supposed to be able to express it. "What keeps you going, traitor? What do you want?" Just before the life signal of the Astartes shut down completely in Leximus' sensors, immediately followed by the tech priest's own blip, Leximus heard the answer, a whispered word that sent shivers down to his very soul. "More. The Oblivion's Keeper is under our control, Awakened One," said Koldak through the vox. "We have just received reports from the Pax aboard that they have secured both objectives." "Casualties?" came the reply. Lord Archon was still in the room where the Coven had cast their spells, waiting for his warrior's return while directing the rest of the battle by vox. "Several, but I have no exact number at the moment. The former word-bearers report 3 killed and 2 wounded, only one of them heavily, and those of the 3rd Legion." Koldak hesitated. "Well, their reports are less than perfectly clear." "I see," answered Lord Archon. "Don't let them know you said that, though. They take perfection a little too seriously, even though I cannot understand why, considering what they have become. Something to do with the philosophy of the Prince of Excess, apparently, but that is something you and I both would do well to stay away from." "Of course, my lord." "What is the status of the other groups?" Koldak quickly brought up the data demanded by his lord. The other ships were still fighting. The Blood Champion especially was encountering difficulties, if Koldak's interpretations of the screams transmitted by the creature's packs was reliable. But in the end, all would either submit, or die. The Hand of Ruin was simply too powerful, its crew too experienced, to let them destroy it before the boarders could do their job. Of course, as with all forms of war, it could still go wrong. If the boarders failed, then the battle would become protracted, and things could turn against the traitor ship, but there was nothing Koldak could do about it apart from listening to the reports from the packs teleported onto the enemy fleet, and pray the true pantheon for victory. The ships are still resisting. It appears they have more troops aboard than the Oblivion's Keeper did. And how is the Hand of Ruin? We are fine, sir. Our shields are holding what we cannot dodge, and we are still within teleporting range of the 7 remaining enemy vessels. Is there any problem on your side of things? No. Keep up the good work, Captain. We will need these ships to be ours soon. Koldak hesitated for a moment, then, seeing as the battle didn't need his intervention for another few seconds, asked the question he had been meaning to ask ever since they had emerged into the Paraxis system. Sir, if may ask, how do you plan to use these ships? The warp storm is still raging, and even our own navigators have difficulty driving one ship through it. The few we captured at Mueller still aren't trained to sail the currents of the Sea of Souls according to their methods. Even if we take them, how could we bring them through the warp? Come on, Koldak. You of all people should know that battleships are useful for more than mere travel. The bridge of the Maleficence's reward was filled with the sounds of battle. Reports and orders were shout, weapons were brought to bear toward their singular target by remotely controlled servitors, and 1,000 more tasks were taking place simultaneously as the crew of the Loyalist ship did what they did best. It was a symphony of organized chaos, a perfection born of gruesome practice in the most unforgiving conditions. Yet one sound was unusual, though not entirely unknown. More and more screams came from the Vox channels opened with the troops sent to deal with the boarders. Hundreds of men, trained by the institutions established by Robute Gulaman's Legion when they had liberated the system, that had been ready to join the Great Crusade when it had fallen apart. They had fought in the heresy, risking their lives to put down the cults that had risen from the madness of the Civil War. Though Paraxis had been largely untouched by the conflict, even this system had felt the waves of such destruction. They were brave men, loyal to the throne of terror even as the galaxy they had been trained to fight in had collapsed around them. And now, they were dying in troves, slaughtered like animals by the monsters that walked his ship, and there was nothing Oswald could do to save them. The only thing the Admiral could do was make their sacrifice worth it by bringing down the vessel that had carried the invaders, and it didn't seem he was going to accomplish even that. His hands tightened around his command chair. Oswald Von Libestat watched as the traitor ship dodged yet another volley. Whoever the enemy's commander was, the bastard was a damn genius at space war. And still, Oswald couldn't make sense of the moves his enemy made. The Astartes vessel was taking absurd risks. According to the conclusions of the cogitators, the only logical explanation was that it needed to stay within a certain range of all the Imperial ships at the same time. It didn't make sense, but then again, neither did the sudden teleportation of teams of boarders across the entirety of Oswald's ships. The Oblivion's Keeper was already lost, its self-destruction foiled, and had started to run away from the fighting proper. Doubtlessly, those now in command of the ship didn't want to risk their prize being destroyed while they couldn't even operate it properly. Still, all wasn't lost. They could still win this, and even if they couldn't, they could make sure the rest of the sector was safe. If they could take down that one ship, then the traitors would be stranded in the Paraxis system. Billions would still be at the mercy of the traitors who would manage to escape the ship's destruction and those who had taken one of the Loyalist ships, but there would be no navigator to allow them to bring their evil to the rest of the galaxy. But do they even need a navigator at all? Wondered Oswald. He had seen too many things that didn't make sense in the Civil War to believe that anything, no matter how unlikely his knowledge told him, was impossible. And bringing a ship here in the first place was supposed to be impossible. Even now, the Admiral could see the tempest that had isolated the entirety of the Trebedius sector from the rest of the galaxy, where the space between stars had once been black and empty. It now surged with colors that didn't exist and the movements of beings that shouldn't exist. How in the name of terror had the traitors even crossed the infernal storm? What had Mathus said, that the storm? The Admiral's blood ran cold. Mathus. Oh, sweet merciful Emperor. In the confusion, he had completely forgotten about the astropath. When he had even ordered all troops to converge on the borders, he hadn't had the time to wait for all of them to report. For one terrible moment, Oswald hesitated. What to do? Ask for a report? Were the guards of the astropath's room even still alive? Were they engaged in battle against the invaders after having dealt with Mathos' situation, and his call was about to distract them and sentence them to death? Were they already dead, and a demon roaming the ship at this moment? What he could make of the soldiers' confused shouts and screams seemed to indicate that the boarders already had one with them. Could this situation get any worse? "Admiral," shouted one of the deck officers. "We have just lost contact with the Liberation's price." For a fraction of a second, Oswald von Libestat thought he could hear something laughing at him in the distance. Then he swore violently, and began to adjust his strategy to the loss of another ship. "I am covered in blood, but it doesn't last. My armor skin dries in a matter of seconds, the coppery fluid drained by the unholy life that beats within the ceramite's confines. This is how the thirst is slaked, how the parchment of my throat can be fought and defeated for a time. I drink blood from my armor skin, and it sates whatever it is that has replaced my mortal appetites. The mortals before me are weak. Determined, that much I can give them, but weak. It reminds me of when the demon and I first became one. Their flesh burst under even the slightest of my blows, the chain axe I still carry bites through their fragile skin and feeds off their lives. I can feel the weapon's own sentience, awakened by too much bloodletting. It is a vicious and cruel thing, every bit as bloodthirsty as the demon in me. The weapon isn't as we are. The crude spirit that the deceived fools of the Red World placed within it is merely being influenced by my presence in you, brother." The demon's voice is a mix of emotions it shouldn't be allowed to feel. While Khan is reveling in the bloodshed, I also hear a tingle of annoyance in its tone, hidden behind the growls and echoes of screams that make up its voice in my head. It doesn't enjoy me comparing my weapon's own hunger to the one we share. My former brothers are fighting all around me, their souls consumed by the blood god's touch. I can see it so clearly now, how they have changed. The butcher's nails are so much more than simple copies of Angron's own archaeotech implants. They are his tools, his instruments. Despite the blood god's despise of treachery and subterfuge, it appears he isn't above some manipulation of his own if the result is an entire legion dedicated to him, willingly or not. You and your kindred should be grateful to the great and mighty Khorne. He has given you purpose, clarity, and more than all, he has given you strength. Strength? These things mark their skulls as belonging to this abomination of hatred and rage that you call master. We are slaves. All of us. It is all we have ever been, and now, it is all we shall ever be. My voice and the demons become one once more as the rage I feel aligns itself with Hecaran's natural state, and I jump at the terrified mortals that still stand before me. They are aligned, blocking one of the ship's corridors, their weapons primed and aimed directly at me. Though me and my brethren have killed hundreds of them, there are still many of them left, and the 30 or so that now block my path may still hurt me, if they aim carefully or get a lucky shot. I am not, despite Hecaran's boasts, invincible. In battle, I feel pain. I bleed, my own blood drunk by my armor skin just as easily as the soldiers. And as Angron told us all, anything that bleeds can be killed. Perhaps I will die here, too. I doubt it, though. Mere humans can hardly hope to ever truly harm me, let alone kill me. Hecaran's power heals my wounds too quickly, makes me too strong for them to defeat me. And as long as the blood flows, as long as I stand victorious, even if I take 1,000 wounds, I shall not die. I know this. Yes, for it is the truth. The blood god will not let you die, brother. Not until you fail him. Then, and only then, will your skull be added to his throne. Yes. In the meantime, let us kill, for the awakened one, for the forsaken sons, for the life that was taken from me. All of these causes are but illusions, my brother. You and I know why it is we fight. We fight for the one true purpose in this realm of matter, to spill blood in Khorne's glorious name. Sergeant Dillon was terrified, yet none of the men under his command appeared to be able to see it. They were cowering in one of the less used corridors of the Maleficence's reward, their guns pointed toward where it was most probable the danger would come from, but they didn't contest his orders, and appeared to be doing well themselves on the front of keeping their own fear under control. That level of discipline was inspiring, even to a veteran like Dillon. That he himself was holding the pieces of his sanity together didn't surprise him, because not showing that you were afraid was the base of command, and even in such a desperate situation, his training didn't let him down, keeping his face a mask of resolution and confidence thanks to instincts that had been hammered in his subconscious by hundreds of battles. Emperor. Hundreds. Had he really served that long? He knew he was an old man, 60 standard years if the Cronus aboard ships were to be trusted. Not too aged to serve by the Imperium's standards, even though his rank didn't allow him access to rejuvenation treatments, not that they had them now, but he still felt that he was too old to deal with something like this. Then again, there probably wasn't anyone in the entire galaxy that could deal with something like this. The day had started as normally as any other had since the War Master had gone mad and brought civil war to the Imperium, burning the dream of mankind in the flames of his insane ambition. Dylan had woken up, forced the youngsters under his command to get up as well, and, once ready, they had gone to replace another squad as guards of the astropath's chamber. Not the best job there was aboard the Maleficence's reward, but one that needed to be done, and could only be entrusted to those of the 2,000 soldiers on the ship whose training had covered the possibility of a warp messenger losing himself to the warp. That meant none of the guardsmen they had brought up from the worlds in the system were qualified. And now, Dylan felt that he wasn't qualified either. They had received the Admiral's order just before every alarm on the ship had went on at the same time, forming what the crew had nicknamed the fracas, "They are here" signal. The alarms had stopped a moment later, and, at that sign that the rest of the crew were doing all that was possible to take care of whatever had happened, Dylan and his squad, 20 men armed with standard lasguns, unlike he who carried a bolter as symbol of his rank, back to the astropath's chamber. Kurt had been the first to die. Brave, stupid Kurt. Always ready to take point, even if there was no telling what kind of danger awaited them. The lad had once told Dylan, after one too many drinks, that he did it because he was too scared of letting another die if he could have been in his place. If it hadn't been as horrible, perhaps he would have been satisfied with the way he finally met his end. But regardless of his sacrifice's value, being cut in two by the tentacle of some abomination spawned by the warp wasn't a good way to die. Despite the fact that the creature had killed 9 of his men in as many seconds, the sergeant hadn't seen much before he had called for a retreat, or perhaps he had seen it, but his mind was unable to accept what he had seen and refused to remember it. When the warp was involved, it was hard to tell. He did remember, however, that the thing had been big, and its shape inconsistent. He remembered flesh rippling like water, muscles and limbs rearranging themselves as if clay under the hands of some invisible, insane sculptor. The only thing that had indicated that the thing had once been poor Mathus had been the icon of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, once tattooed upon the astropath's flesh and that had somehow remained untouched upon the skin of the beast. Dylan had seen astropaths lost to the warp before. Before the Civil War, they had generally been shot before they had become dangerous. After that, when the warp had gone even madder than it had always been, there had been several instances where he had been tasked with taking down the gibbering lunatics that could make normal men see, hear and feel things that weren't here. When the Admiral had told him to act, he had thought he knew what to expect. And now 9 of his men were dead, and the thing responsible was drawing near. He could feel it, not with any of his 5 senses, but he still could. He wasn't a psycho, but there was no need of that to be able to detect the sheer wrongness of the abomination. "Steady, lads," he said, his voice carried over by the calms in the ears of the men. "Don't look ahead, focus on your weapon. When that beast is here, open fire on my signal. You won't be able to miss it in this corridor. If we can all get a shot at that thing, we should be able to take it down." Wishful thinking, doubtlessly, but it was all they had left at that point. And convincing them that he had a plan was a big help for them. It would ensure they didn't break and run the moment the thing appeared. There was a hissing sound, and the smell of ozone filled the recycled air of the corridor. A moment later, the creature that had emerged from astropath Mathus appeared. To their credit, none of the Navy soldiers ran. They held their ground, firing wildly at the warp-born abomination with their weapons at full power. Sergeant Dylan used his bolt gun on the automatic setting, unloading an entire magazine of the precious ammunition into the corrupted flesh before his weapon clicked empty. Even then, when the monster lurched over him, having already slain his comrades, he held his ground, using the gun as a lump of metal to hit the creature, over and over. Even after a newly formed tentacle that ended with a blade of bone pierced through his chest, lifting him in the air, he continued hitting in vain. Tears running on his cheeks, blood coming from his wound and his mouth, the old man kept fighting. He knew he was going to die. He accepted that fact, as he had accepted it from the moment he had learned that the galaxy burned with the flames of betrayal. There could be no peace in such a galaxy, and a soldier could only ever find a violent death in it. But, by the Emperor's name, he would go down fighting. A mouth formed on the mass of flesh, filled with teeth that reminded Dylan's delirious psyche of that of the great predators that roamed his home-world's oceans. The last thing to cross his mind before the horrific orifice closed on him was sadness at the thought he would never see the waters of Medusas again. Then, there was a flash of pain, and all became dark. But it wasn't the end. His pain continued, growing ever stronger. The very soul of the mortal was ripped apart as the warp-borns that had possessed the astropath consumed it, feeding upon Dylan's emotions and memories. Unspeakable torment ran through each portion of his essence, more and more parts of himself falling either to gibbering madness or burning out in agony. It took Sergeant Patricius Dylan 237 seconds before the last part of his soul vanished from existence entirely. Each of these seconds was worth the pain of an entire century in the care of the Dark Elder's best homunculi. The last of the men dies as one of my pack members beheads him in a single strike. The scent of blood surrounds us, bathing the armors of my brethren. Mine is clean, and already I feel the thirst returning. I thought it may be sated by the dozens of men I had killed this day, but it was a forlorn hope. Nothing can sate this thirst, for it is that of the Khorne. Each battle is merely a temporary respite from it, a false peace bought by the lives of all those I kill. I should have known that. I have been sent to other battles by the Awakened One since me and Hekaran became one, crushing pockets of resistance in the Mueller system and slaughtering those of the humans aboard the Hand of Ruin who dared to try to revolt. Every time, the thirst merely recoiled for a moment as my armor drank the ichor spilled upon it. But I had thought that this, a true battle, against an enemy that actually resists me, would be different. It isn't. Like drinking salty water, it only makes me thirst for more in the end. They were too weak to be a true battle, brother. Only in pure battle may the thirst be truly sated for a while. But what kind of enemy is there in this galaxy that may be able to challenge us? Alexandra died by our hands, yet his blood didn't satisfy the Skullfather. What more can we offer to the Blood God? Everything. I try not to think about the demon's words, to force my mind not to notice the eagerness in its tone, hidden beneath the screaming. To take my focus elsewhere, I look outside instead of inside, and watch my brethren. 10 are still standing. We have lost 2 since we arrived on this ship. They are not dead, simply gone, wandering away from our group in pursuit of prey. The rest are being kept near me by the power I wield, the remnants of instinct, hypno-indoctrination and habit born of 1,000 battlefields making them follow whoever is the strongest warrior. Even now, covered in gore, they still hunger for more, the butcher's nails punishing them for stopping the killing, even though there is no more enemies to slay. They are different now, their armor finally repaired and adapted to their granted desires by the servants of Mercurian. The tech priests have refashioned broken helms and breastplates to better reflect the true nature of those who wear them. Images of skull and blades are engraved upon the ceramite in bronze, and while the emblem of the Legion, a jaw enclosing a world, is gone from almost all of them, a new emblem has been branded on most of their breastplates, in imitation of the one that has formed on mine. The skull rune, the emblem of Khorne. They wear it as a mark of honor, of devotion, of power. I see it for what it is, the brand of slavery. And if I don't act soon, they will start killing each other in the name of our Dark Master. They have begun to understand, in their warped and tormented minds, what it is that has made us what we now are. They know, on some instinctive level, the power of the warp that has enforced our transformation. But all that knowledge is useless when the nails start to sing. I start walking, and they follow, abandoning the corpses of their victims to join the leader of their pack. Our target is the command bridge. The sorcerers didn't teleport us directly in it. In truth, it is a miracle we ended up into the ship at all. The shields are still raised, making standard teleportation impossible. But little we use these days can be called standard anymore. Fortunately, this ship is built on a classic pattern, one that even the sons of Angron are capable of navigating through with ease. Finding our way is easy, even with the butcher's nails biting in the brains of my brethren. World Eaters have always been expert at boarding actions. After all, we never enjoyed watching our opponents burn in space. We need to see them die with the weapon that killed them in our hand. That has always been our way, even when we were still called the Warhounds, so long ago. I can see the soul of our target, the one commanding the ship and the rest of the fleet. Hecaran's senses and mine are one, and through the immaterium, the soul of Admiral Von Libestat burns like a sun, hurting if I look at it for too long. It shines with duty, honor, loyalty, faith. The awakened one mentioned that the human commander was one of these fools who believe in the false emperor's divinity, but can it be that his misguided belief is what grant his soul such radiance? He can believe in the anathema all he wants. Every prayer, every offering, every sacrifice, it only makes the Empyrean stronger. They can feed him their faith and belief, and turn him into a god if that is what they want. He will be a carrion lord, endlessly trapped in agony, unable to die and unable to live. An eternity of torture, a fitting punishment for the one who dared to challenge the glory of chaos. I do not understand the meaning of Hecaran's rambling, and I do not care. Whenever it starts talking about the false emperor, its words stop making any sense that I can perceive. Perhaps the former members of the 17th Legion could, but I have no desire to associate with such fanatics, as hypocritical as that may be. The archpriest of the primordial truth and his sons have been blessed with the understanding of the God's true purpose, their eyes open to the secrets hidden beyond reality. They understand this, only by sacrifice to the ruinous powers can mankind endure, and the only sacrifice that matters is blood. We will. Hecaran suddenly stops, and I know at once why. Something is coming. Something that isn't mortal, something dangerous. Something that is familiar. I hear the wailing of tormented souls, and it takes me a few seconds to realize that it isn't Hecaran usual sounding. This is real, this is in the plane of flesh. Then the source of the noise appears, emerging from a turn in the corridors of the ship, and for a second I wonder if I have gone even more insane than I should be. I have seen a lot of things in my existence. I have walked the soil of terror as the skies of the throne world burned with war, and waged war against 1,000 different foes during the Great Crusade. I share my body with a being of the Empyrean, and my soul belongs to a god that cares only for the spilling of blood. Yet this, I cannot move. For a fraction of a second, I am frozen still where I stand. Not because I am afraid, fear was thrice removed from me, first when I became an Astartes, then when the nails were put into my skull, and finally when Hecaran and I became one. But because I just cannot accept the reality of the thing before me. Servant of the great mutator. Spawn of the Prince of Lies. Agent of the Changer of Ways. In the name of Great Corn, kill it. Kill it now. As Hecaran shouts its hatred in my head and through the warp, I feel its knowledge of the beast before me penetrating my own mind. It is a creature of Zeonch, one of the dark gods. I remember the 1,000 suns shouting that name at terror while casting their sorceries at the walls of the Imperial Palace. It is a power rival to the one that owns me and my former legion, one that thrives in deceits and sorceries, one that knows nothing of honor and battle. 999 demons are placed within that beast, bound together by the design of some greater entity of the courts of change. The result is a writhing mass of flesh, constantly mutating. With the senses granted to me by the demon, I can see the hundred of beings from the beyond that have found their way within it, each of them trying to reshape it to its desire. It is like watching armies fighting for a city, rebuilding it only for it to be torn down once another claims it. Faces appear and vanish on its skin, tumors form and dissolve in the blink of an eye, mouths open in screams before being shut forever as the flesh closes on them like a fast-healing scar. A tentacle covered in chitinous armor spurts towards me, and the trance is broken. I catch the appendage with my left hand, and swing my chain axe with my right. The screeching blade tears apart the pale, bloated flesh, spilling black ichor. The taste of it on my armor skin is foul and rotten, and Hecaran screams in anger and outrage. I feel the sparks of warp energies within the tainted blood being consumed by my armor skin, the tiny demons wiped out of existence as their power is used to fuel my strength. I pull with my left arm, dragging the thing closer so that I can finish it. But it is stronger than I expected, and resist my pull. Another limb strikes me in the side, and am I actually sent flying? Just how strong is that abomination? I crash through one of the walls, dragging my opponent with me. Physics say that such a thing shouldn't be possible, but both me and the warp spawn aren't their subject. We roll on each other, exchanging blows that are either deflected by my armor or absorbed by the sheer mass of the thing. Our battle goes on, and we move through the ship, smashing through walls as if they were wood, our human frames breaking ceilings and floors. My rage and Hecaran's rise together, until the point when I can no longer distinguish between the demon's own impulses and my own. We are both consumed by an anger that has nothing to do with pain engines, and for the first time since I and the demon were bound to each other by the blood of Mueller Prime's people, I lose myself to the Red Veil. Blood for the Blood God. Skulls for the Skull Throne. 3 ships had been lost to the enemy. 2 more were already destroyed, their warp engines overwhelmed by ritual self-destruct commands when the boarders had proved they were too strong to be repelled. Whatever the final issue of the battle this day, Oswald knew that the Imperium would not emerge victorious. He still had 3 ships under his command, the Maleficence's Reward, the Pride of Sol and the Herald of Vindication, but he doubted now that they could take down the enemy vessel. The Hand of Ruin was simply too fast, too well armed and shielded. It had taken damage in the course of the confrontation, of course. Several batteries had been crippled, a few clean hits had passed through their shields in the seconds it took them to reload, but Oswald couldn't help but think that every blow they had inflicted had been allowed to land after careful calculation of the pros and cons of such a course of action. In the end, the one advantage that the traitors had, the Astartes, had proved too much for him to overcome. Oswald had lost the battle, and if the traitor ship had chosen to destroy them, it could do so at any moment now. Its superior firepower was enough to take on the 3 remaining ships on its own. The Admiral was considering telling the Pride and the Herald to retreat as he launched the Maleficence's Reward into a ramming attack on the renegades. The boarders were getting closer and closer to the bridge, though their advance had slowed since the unholy monstrosity that had been leading them so far had mysteriously vanished. The ship's sensors couldn't track its presence. In fact, they couldn't track anything since the moment the boarders had first appeared. There had been a flash that had told them the entry point of the enemy, then the augurs had died. The only way to detect them had been to wait for the reports of destruction that came from the machines in the sectors they crossed, and it wasn't nearly as effective than what they were used to. Perhaps they could still crash against the Astartes ship before the boarders reached them. It was a long shot, but at that point, it was all they could hope to accomplish. The Herald's crew had managed to repel the boarders that had assaulted them. Reports from the ship said that once they had managed to kill half of them by dropping pieces of the engines waiting for repairs on them, the rest had just vanished back into the warp. The Pride was still in the same situation as the Reward itself, but perhaps they would manage to do the same. In any case, if a ship was to sacrifice itself to take down the invader, then it would be Oswald's. Then, as he was going to give the order, his communication unit lit up with an incoming transmission. Looking at the identification rune of the sender, Oswald Von Libestat felt his blood run cold. He clicked on the rune, and listened to the one-way transmission. "This is Sergeant Dillon. I am currently engaging the leader of the assailants on the 66th deck. You must expel the compartment into space, sir. We won't be able to hold it for long." Dillon? How? No. It didn't matter, or rather, he didn't have the time to investigate. The Admiral brought up the data about the 66th deck, and yes, there was a succession of damage reports from the machine spirits of the engines located in this section. A quick analysis showed him that if he did void the compartment into space, the shields of the ship around that section would drop momentarily. It would only last 2 to 3 minutes, a mere blink in a void war, but it would be enough of an opening for the Hand of Ruin to seize it and inflict considerable damage if its commander so wished. While the traitor ship had so far minimized the damage to the other ships, it had proved that it had no such reserves concerning the Maleficence's Reward. Doubtlessly the enemy commander, that traitor he had talked with before the battle had started, wanted him dead. The Hand of Ruin would take the shot, even if it meant sacrificing the Astartes they had sent on board. But, looking one last time at the data of the battle, Oswald Von Libestat took his decision. Only 6 seconds had passed since the desperate transmission from Sergeant Dillon. "I roar as I rip my enemy in half with my clawed hands. I have lost my chain axe in the battle. I do not remember when or how. But this should be enough. My foe must be dead." The essence of the life that was used as both beacon and gateway for the warp-borns that animate the spawn is destroyed, and without it, the construct of matter and soul should crumble apart. That knowledge comes from Hekaran, but I do not care at that moment. For, right now, the thirst has stopped. The foul blood of the beast covers me, its taste horrible enough to make one such as I feel nauseous, and yet I haven't felt as free as I have since the nails were first hammered in my skull by the Legion's apothecaries. Hekaran is screaming in triumph, reveling our victory over an agent of another of the Octid. And then, cold, and pain. My balance is still unsteady from the many wounds I have taken that haven't healed yet, and a gust of air takes me up. Icicles form on my armor skin as the temperature drops alarmingly. The few systems of my armor that still work shout out warnings in my helmet: low temperature, loss of atmosphere, depressurization. Did those in command of the ship just void the entire compartment into space? I try to climb to something, but it is too late. It has already been a few seconds, yet the ship is already too far away, moving at what is slow speed for spacecraft, but is still several hundred kilometers per minute. I see the remnants of my foe floating in the void near me, and suddenly, I understand. I have been tricked. I thought I had won, but the spawn led me to the outside parts of the ship, and somehow managed to make the crew empty it into the void. Deceit. Treachery. Cowardice. We shall hunt down the ones responsible, and offer their skulls to the blood god. I roar my anger at being deprived of my victory, and when I realize that I have failed in my mission, I only screams louder. My screams are carried over the Empyrean, echoing into the souls of those mortals that dared to do such a thing to me. Do they think I will die? Even a normal Astartes can survive void exposure for a short while. And I am no normal Astartes. I will survive this, and I will have my revenge. We will destroy them all, and track and punish those of the Changer that dared to help the anathema's slaves. I trash around in the void, unable to control my anger. Then, suddenly, I feel the Empyrean stirring. Something is happening. Through the veil of my rage, it takes me a few seconds to recognize it. It is the same spell that was used on me and my brethren to send us aboard the Loyalist ship. I am being drawn back. There is a flash of pain as I cross the immaterium, and I am in front of the awakened one. Despite the utter calmness of his expression, I can sense the anger dwelling beneath. It makes my own fury rise in response, despite the fact that I now stand before my lord, having failed in the task he has assigned me. Hector Hecaran, he says in his cold, dead voice, the true name of the demon worthing me, causing it to shiver. The sorcerers near him flinch at the name being spoken so casually. To master a demon takes more than simply knowing some assemblage of syllables. One must understand that demon's very nature, and Hecaran is a powerful demon of the blood god. Merely listening to its name causes pain to these wielders of sorcery. I feel my anger rising again at the sight of them, until Archon speaks again. His words are colder than ice, and they make the demon whimper with the barely contained threat they are holding. How in the name of Angron is he doing that? Ah, of course. True naming. Remembering a warborn that you literally hold its essence in your hands is a good way to intimidate even a creature made of pure rage, hatred and bloodlust, apparently. You will be quiet now. You have failed me, but that failure was still within the possibilities I had anticipated. This battle will still end in our victory, but for it to become play I need to be able to deal with the situation now, which means I don't have the time to take care of you right away. You will stay here. You will not move. Then I will come back, and we will talk. He turns his back on me, and leaves the room. The members of the coven follow him, and the rest of the Astartes go after them. Besides my brethren, I recognize those who have been sent on another ship. Like me, their armor is hissing with vapor in the aftermath of teleportation. They have just been brought back, and since I can no longer feel the tension of sorcery in the air, they were the last. I try to move, but I cannot. My flesh is as unmoving as stone. I feel panic rising, then I hear Hecaran's voice. It is filled with grudging respect and carefully hidden dread, but we are one, and it cannot hide anything from me. We are bound, until he delivers us. Your lord has grown even stronger, brother. On the deck of the Hand of Ruin, one of Koldak's aides shouted at him with a note of incredulity in his voice. The shields of the Maleficence's reward just went down, sir. They have voided one of their compartments. What? Why in the name of Horus would they, of course? The crew of the Loyalist flagship had to have taken this desperate measure in a last-ditch attempt to kill the former World Eaters that had been sent aboard them. The captain of the Astartes ship opened a vox channel to the awakened one. The Lord of the Forsaken Sons answered at once. I know why you are calling, Koldak. The Coven have already dragged these fools back here. Take the shot, now. Reduce these fools' ship into dust. Koldak gave the order, and a volley was sent toward the vulnerable spot in the enemy ship's defenses. Spears of light pierced the void, the energy of several suns focused on the tiny point thousands of kilometers away. In the shipmaster's estimation, it would not be enough to destroy the ship. The point was simply too far away from any sensible parts. But it would cripple them, and they would be able to finish them easily. The Awakened One had demanded the death of this particular ship, and while its crew would be spared death at the hands of the Blood Champion and his followers, they would still die, their souls at the mercy of the denizens of the warp. The impact was tremendous, shaking the entire ship. Alarms rose on the command deck, quickly shut down. The tech priests would have to work on their own, to ensure that the last gambit of the Maleficence's rewards captain succeeded. The engines of the ship burned, propelling it toward the Astartes traitor vessel with full speed. To the outside eye, it may have looked like a ramming run, but it was clear that the Loyalist ship would miss its target, as the Hand of Ruin was far maniable enough to dodge such a last-ditch attempt, if the Maleficence's reward could even reach it before being destroyed by enemy fire. A transmission arrived from the Pride of Sol. Oswald opened the channel while the rest of his crew prepared to execute the last maneuver he had ordered. "Admiral Oswald, your ship is too damaged for a ramming run. They will destroy you before you can reach them. The Pride of Sol will execute your plan. You and the Herald need to retreat." "Don't give me orders, Captain. I am still commander of this fleet." "You must survive, Admiral. The people of Paraxis will need you in the war to come. They will need space support when they fight the battles on the ground." "Indeed they will. But the Maleficence's reward will not escape this battle, Captain. We are too wounded for flight. You will give them the help they need. And what I have in mind is not a ramming run. Now, go. We will cover your retreat." "But this is my final order. Pride of Sol and Herald of Vindication, retreat to the system's edge and prepare to support the war for the Paraxisian worlds. The Emperor protects." The Admiral shut the Vox channel, and looked around him. All the crew members were watching him, and he felt pride swell in his chest when he saw that though they were scared, none of them were going to contest his decision. They were going to die, of that there was no question. But in death they would harm the enemies of the Emperor, and that, Oswald realized, was all that a faithful could ever ask for. "Admiral," said one of them. Its insignia marked him as a low-ranked weaponry officer, but Marcus had been gunmaster of the Maleficence's reward for 2 years now, though they hadn't had the means to replace his uniform. "We will be in range of the enemy ship in 15 seconds. "Very well. Overload the warp core." "It has been an honor to sail with you, Admiral." "No, lad. The honor is mine." "By the Opted," whispered Koldak in shock as he finally realized what the Loyalists were planning. "They are insane." Detonating the warp core that allowed the ship to sail the Empyrean was not something that was even supposed to be possible. It had been done before, of course, as a last recourse to take down as many opponents with you as you could, or, he had heard, as a way to signal one's position when you were stranded in space without a navigator. But there were reasons that such a thing was considered too insanely dangerous for even the War Master, who, blessed be his name, had still been a ruthless if genial individual. A warp core was dangerous. Even when the ship wasn't in transit, it had to be shielded by Geller fields to prevent breaches from the Sea of Souls. Detonating it could collapse the border between the warp and reality, and that could cause such damage that the giant explosion it also caused was generally not even taken in consideration. But of course, that was under normal circumstances, and Koldak cursed himself that he hadn't thought of it sooner. It appeared that the one in command of the Loyalist fleet wasn't as much of a conventional tactician as he had thought. They weren't in real space right now. They were in a warp storm. He had absolutely no idea of what would happen when the warp core detonated, but he knew one thing for certain: it had a very high chance of killing them all. "All batteries, open fire. Destroy that ship before it gets too close. Engines at full power, get us as far away from it as you can. Raise the Geller field, and tell the navigators to prepare to take command of the ship in case whatever happens plunge us fully into the warp. And someone shut off this proximity alarm. The other 2 ships are escaping," signaled one of the officers. "Let them go," snapped the shipmaster before adding, as an afterthought, "and tell the ships we captured to get as far away as they can, too. We are being hailed by the enemy ship, sir." "What?" "Open the channel." The only thing passing through the channel before it was closed was an audio transmission. "Traitors, this is the end. You will die, and those of your kind that have taken refuge aboard the ships they have stolen will be unable to do further harm to the Imperium. In the name of the Emperor, die. All hands, brace for impact.